Welcome back to Roman History for Sleep. Rome has had 3 kings now. Romulus, who founded the city with violence, Numa, who taught it to pray, Tullus, who returned it to war and died for his arrogance. The pattern is clear. Rome swings between extremes. Warrior, then priest, then warrior again. So when they choose Ancus Marcius, Numa's grandson, everyone expects peace, temples, quiet years. They're half right. Ancus will build, he'll create infrastructure that lasts centuries. He'll expand Rome's reach to the sea, but he'll also fight when he must, because he understands what none of his predecessors fully grasped. Rome needs both the sword and the plough. Gentle settle beside the fire. The 4th reign begins. The Senate met 3 days after they buried what remained of Tullus Hostilius. Not long enough for proper mourning. Barely enough time to clear the ashes and stop smelling lightning in the air. But Rome needed a king, and waiting felt dangerous. The city had learned that leaderless periods invited both internal chaos and external opportunism. Better to choose quickly and establish authority before someone decided Rome looked vulnerable. They gathered in the forum under grey skies that threatened rain but never quite delivered. The mood was careful, deliberate, weighted with the understanding that they'd made mistakes before and couldn't afford to make them again. Proculus spoke first. He was ancient now, had served under every king Rome had known, had watched the city transform from Romulus's violent founding, through Numa's peaceful consolidation to Tullus's aggressive expansion. He'd seen everything work and everything fail, and his voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd outlived most of his certainty. "We need to talk about what we've learned," he said, addressing the assembled senators with the frankness that comes when you're too old to care about political niceties. 3 kings. 3 completely different approaches. 3 different results, 2 of which ended badly. "Only 2?" someone muttered. "Romulus disappeared in a suspicious storm. Numa died peacefully, but left us vulnerable. And Tullus was struck by lightning while his palace burned. I'm seeing a pattern of badly in various forms." Proculus ignored the interruption with the practiced skill of someone who'd been ignoring interruptions for 50 years. "Rome has a pattern," he continued, "of choosing extremes and then discovering extremes don't work. Romulus was all violence and ambition. Numa was all peace and temples. Tullus was all conquest and military expansion. Each worked until it didn't. Each left us solving the problems their approach created." The senators shifted uncomfortably. No one wanted to say it directly, but everyone was thinking it. Maybe Rome's problem wasn't finding the right extreme, but choosing extremes in the first place. "So what do we choose now?" another senator asked. "Another warrior? Another priest? Another king who embodies one thing completely while ignoring everything else?" "We choose someone," Proculus said carefully, "who understands that Rome needs multiple things simultaneously. Someone who can be warrior when necessary, and priest when appropriate and practical, administrator the rest of the time. Someone who won't get struck by lightning for neglecting the gods, but also won't let our neighbors think we've forgotten how swords work." "You're describing someone who doesn't exist," a practical-minded senator objected. "Someone perfect. Someone who can do everything our previous kings did individually, but somehow do it all at once without going insane or getting hit by divine lightning. I'm describing someone who at least understands the need for balance," Proculus corrected, "which is better than starting with kings who think balance is weakness and extremism is virtue. Do we have anyone like that?" Proculus paused for effect. Numa's grandson. The silence that followed was profound. Several senators looked like they wanted to object but couldn't quite figure out which part to object to first. "Numa Pompilius," Proculus continued, "the peaceful king. The one who built temples and consulted springs and spent 43 years teaching Rome to breathe. He had a daughter. She married well. Sabine family. Good connections. They had a son. Named him Ancus Marcius. Let me guess," someone said. "He's exactly like Numa? Talks to springs? Builds temples? Makes us all learn complicated religious calendars?" "Actually, no," Proculus said. "He studied both religious practice and military strategy. He understands his grandfather's legacy but isn't imprisoned by it. He's spent his life deliberately avoiding attention, which suggests he has good judgment about when to step forward and when not to. Or it suggests he's not ambitious enough to be king," another voice countered. "Or it suggests he's smart enough not to want the job until the job actually needs him," Proculus replied. "Which seems like decent qualification these days." The Senate debated. Some worried that choosing based on lineage rather than merit was dangerous precedent. Others thought the symbolic value of Numa's grandson was exactly what Rome needed, a signal that they were returning to spiritual health while maintaining practical strength. Still others wondered if any human could actually balance opposing principles without failing at both, and possibly getting struck by lightning in the process. Also, one senator added thoughtfully, being Numa's grandson means he grew up with impossible expectations. If he hasn't collapsed under that pressure by age 40, he's probably more resilient than most of us. Or more stubborn, someone else suggested. We'll take either, Proculus said. Resilient or stubborn, both work for this particular job. Finally, as afternoon light started to fade, they voted. Ancus Marcius, grandson of Numa Pompilius, would be offered the throne. If he accepted, and that was a significant if, because who actually wanted this job after watching the previous king die in flames? Rome would have its fourth king. They dispatched messengers immediately. Found Ancus Marcius in his modest house on the Quirinal Hill, studying agricultural reports and religious calendars in equal measure, living the kind of quiet life that people with famous grandfathers sometimes chose when they wanted to avoid being crushed by expectation. The messengers delivered the Senate's offer with appropriate ceremony. Ancus listened without interrupting, his expression carefully neutral, giving nothing away except perhaps a slight twitch near his left eye that suggested he'd been dreading exactly this conversation for approximately 40 years. When they finished, he asked for time to consider. Not long, just overnight. He'd give his answer at dawn. The messengers left, and Ancus sat alone in his study, looking at the agricultural reports and the religious calendars, and thinking about burdens he'd spent 40 years trying to avoid and had just run out of room to escape. Ancus Marcius had always known this might happen. Not known with certainty, but suspected, worried about, prepared for, in the quiet, private way people prepare for unwanted possibilities they can't quite prevent. Like knowing eventually you'll have to have an uncomfortable conversation with your elderly relative about their driving, or that someday you'll need to clean out that storage room you've been ignoring for a decade. Except instead of storage rooms, it was kingship. And instead of uncomfortable conversations, it was rule over an entire city that kept making dramatically bad leadership decisions. Being Numa Pompilius' grandson was complicated. The old king had been dead for over 20 years, but his legacy persisted. Temples still functioning, priesthood still operating, the calendar still organizing time exactly as he'd designed it. Numa's infrastructure had outlasted Numa himself, and looked likely to outlast everyone currently alive, which meant comparisons were inevitable. Every religious ceremony, every properly performed ritual, every festival that happened when it was supposed to happen, all of it carried Numa's invisible presence, and by extension, all of it carried expectations about his descendants. Ancus had dealt with those expectations his entire life. The priests who looked at him hopefully, wondering if Numa's spiritual wisdom had been passed down genetically like height or nose shape. The politicians who calculated whether the Numa connection could be politically useful. The ordinary citizens who saw his name and immediately asked, "Are you related to?" Yes, he was related to. And no, he wasn't the same person. And yes, he understood the legacy. And no, he didn't spontaneously receive wisdom from springs, or hear goddesses speaking through running water, or experience divine visions during routine temple visits. He was just someone who'd studied both military strategy and religious practice, because his grandfather's legacy meant he couldn't afford to be completely incompetent at either one. Someone who'd built a quiet, careful life, specifically designed to avoid the attention currently being offered to him by the entire Roman Senate. That plan had worked beautifully for 40 years. And now it had failed completely. Ancus walked through his modest house thinking. His wife had gone to bed already. She'd asked if he wanted to talk, but he'd declined. This was a decision only he could make, and talking would just delay the inevitable choice while making someone else anxious about it. The house was modest by patrician standards, comfortable but not luxurious, the kind of place that suggested competence and good taste without advertising wealth or ambition. Ancus had chosen it deliberately, back when he'd still thought he could avoid being noticed by history. That seemed adorably naive now. History noticed everyone eventually, especially if you were related to someone history had already noticed extensively, and then spent several scrolls commemorating. He found himself in the small shrine room where his wife maintained the household gods. Simple space, nothing elaborate. A few small statues, some offerings, the minimum required for religious propriety. But it was well maintained. His wife took the obligation seriously, even if she didn't make a performance of devotion. Ancus lit a candle and sat on the floor, looking at the household gods and trying to figure out what he actually wanted. The honest answer? He didn't want to be king. Didn't want the burden, the scrutiny, the impossible task of being both Numa and Tullus simultaneously, while also somehow not getting struck by lightning for doing either one wrong. Didn't want to spend however many years he had left trying to satisfy contradictory expectations while everyone compared him unfavourably to a grandfather who'd had the luxury of 43 years of peace to build his legacy and had never needed to wage a single war. But the equally honest answer? Rome needed someone. And if not him, then who? Another warrior like Tullus who'd neglect the gods until lightning corrected him in an extremely permanent fashion. Another priest like Numa who'd let Rome become vulnerable through excessive peace. Another extreme when extremes kept failing spectacularly. At least he understood the problem. At least he knew what Rome needed. Even if he had absolutely no idea whether he could actually provide it without making everything worse or getting struck by some form of divine disapproval, the household gods maintained their small, silent vigil. They were very good at that. Just standing there, being divine, offering no opinions. Very helpful. You could weigh in any time, Ancus said to them quietly. Just a small sign, a flicker, anything suggesting which choice leads to me not dying in flames. The gods continued their silent vigil with practiced expertise. Right, Ancus said. Maintaining divine mystery, I respect that. Very professional. The candle burned lower. The household gods offered no guidance beyond their continued existence, which was apparently their entire contribution to this crisis. Ancus sat in the darkness and tried to find courage for something he didn't want to do. His grandfather had visited groves and consulted springs, and received wisdom from goddesses who spoke through running water. Ancus didn't have that gift, didn't hear voices in running water, didn't feel divine presence in sacred spaces, didn't receive mystical guidance during moments of crisis. He just had practical sense and the ability to see problems clearly, which sometimes felt like poor substitute for mystical wisdom, but was apparently all he was getting. But practical sense was telling him that refusing the throne wouldn't actually save him from the burden, would just pass it to someone else who'd probably handle it worse, would mean watching Rome repeat its mistakes while he sat safely in his modest house and pretended that wasn't his responsibility. Numa's legacy wasn't just temples and priesthoods, it was also obligation. The understanding that sometimes you served not because you wanted to, but because you were capable, and the alternative was watching something important fail while you did nothing. Ancus blew out the candle and went to bed. He'd already made his decision, even if he'd spend the rest of the night pretending he hadn't, and possibly composing a mental list of all the ways this could go catastrophically wrong. At dawn, he'd accept. He'd become Rome's fourth king. He'd try to balance what his predecessors couldn't, and he'd probably fail. But at least he'd fail while trying something that needed attempting, rather than hiding in a modest house and hoping history would forget about him. His wife was still asleep. Ancus lay beside her in the darkness, and thought about the modest house he was about to leave, the quiet life he was about to abandon, the impossible burden he was about to accept because the alternative was letting someone even less qualified make an even bigger mess of things. Being Numa's grandson had finally caught up with him. Tomorrow, Rome would find out if that was blessing or curse. Ancus was betting on somewhere uncomfortably in between, which seemed like the most realistic option. The coronation happened quickly, with less ceremony than Numa's, and more religious attention than Tullus's. A deliberate balance, the Senate learning, finally, to signal intentions through ritual choices. Ancus Marcius stood in the forum at dawn, wearing simple robes that suggested priest more than warrior, while Numa Marcius, the Pontifex Maximus, still alive and serving despite being perhaps 80 now, performed the sacred ceremonies with obvious emotion. "You're Numa's grandson," the old priest said quietly, before the public portion began. "That's both advantage and burden. People will expect miracles because of his name. Try not to let that destroy you." "I'll try," Ancus replied. "No promises." "Good answer," Numa Marcius said. "Promises are how kings get struck by lightning. Vague commitments are much safer. The augurs read omens. Birds flew in appropriately auspicious patterns, or at least the augurs claimed they did, which was functionally the same thing. Augury was as much about interpreting confidence as interpreting bird flight, and these augurs were very confident. The sacred chickens were brought out for their traditional role in major ceremonies. They were supposed to eat grain enthusiastically, which would signal divine approval. The chickens, who had done this job for several years now and understood the routine, ate their grain with the kind of professional enthusiasm that suggested they knew they were being watched, and were determined to get good reviews. "The chickens approve," one augur announced solemnly. "The chickens always approve," someone in the crowd muttered. "They're chickens. They like grain. Divine chickens," the augur corrected with dignity. "There's a difference." Thunder rumbled in the distance despite clear skies, which everyone agreed was Jupiter expressing approval, or at least not expressing active disapproval. Given what had happened to the last king, not expressing active disapproval felt like a significant win. Ancus was crowned with oak leaves, Numa's choice, not Romulus's laurel or Tullus's practical bronze. Another signal, another declaration of intent, also significantly more comfortable than bronze, which was heavy and tended to give you a headache after a few hours. "Rome has suffered divine displeasure," Ancus said, addressing the assembled citizens with the quiet intensity of someone who'd spent the night accepting what he didn't want. "Not because the gods are cruel, but because we neglected them. Tullus Hostilius was a great king in many ways. He expanded Rome's territories, strengthened our military, made us a power that neighbors couldn't ignore, but he forgot that Rome belongs to the gods first and to kings second." He paused, noticing that several people in the crowd were glancing nervously at the sky, as if expecting Jupiter to make editorial comments. "The gods noticed this neglect," Ancus continued, "and they expressed their opinion definitively. I'd prefer not to receive similar feedback, so I'll be maintaining better communication with divine authorities, regular temple visits, proper ceremony, the whole arrangement." A few nervous laughs from the crowd. Too soon for lightning jokes, probably, but the tension needed breaking. "I'm not Tullus," Ancus continued. "I won't lead Rome on constant campaigns, but I'm also not my grandfather Numa. I won't pretend that peace alone keeps cities safe. I'll try to be both. Strong when strength is needed, spiritual when the gods require attention, practical when neither extreme serves Rome's interests." He paused, looking out at faces that were hopeful and skeptical in equal measure. "I'll probably fail," he said, and got surprised laughter from the crowd. "This is an impossible task, but at least I'll fail while trying something that needs attempting. And maybe, if the gods are patient and Rome is willing to learn, we'll discover that balance is actually possible, or at least that it's possible to avoid getting struck by lightning, which feels like a reasonable starting goal." The crowd erupted in applause and relieved laughter. This was not a rousing speech, not the kind that made crowds surge with emotion and pledge their lives to great causes, but it was honest, and honesty felt refreshing after Tullus's certainty and Numa's mysticism. Rome accepted its fourth king with cautious optimism and moderate expectations, which was, Ancus thought, probably the healthiest attitude possible, and also significantly less pressure than "please be exactly like your legendary grandfather, but also completely different." The crowd dispersed. Ancus stood in the forum feeling the weight of oak leaves on his head, and the significantly heavier weight of responsibility settling onto shoulders that had successfully avoided it for 40 years. Numa Marcius approached with a scroll. Actually several scrolls. Actually an entire armful of scrolls that seemed to multiply as he approached. "Your grandfather left instructions," the old priest said, depositing the scrolls into Ancus's arms. "Detailed documentation of every religious ceremony, every ritual requirement, every sacred obligation. He wrote it all down near the end of his life. Said future kings would need guidance when priests couldn't remember details. Of course he did," Ancus said, staggering slightly under the weight. "He documented everything. Probably had charts. Multiple charts," Numa Marcius confirmed. "Very detailed charts, also diagrams, and a comprehensive index. Your grandfather was thorough to the point of compulsion." "How many scrolls is this?" 17, Numa Marcius said, "plus appendices." He was going to write more but ran out of time. Felt very frustrated about the unfinished sections, apparently. Ancus looked at the 17 scrolls that represented his grandfather's attempt to encode an entire religious system in written form. It was simultaneously touching and overwhelming, and also very Numa, the assumption that everything could be solved through careful documentation and explicit instructions. "Is there a summary scroll?" Ancus asked hopefully. "Something like the key points for kings who don't have time to read 17 scrolls?" "Scroll 1, Numa Marcius said. "Though your grandfather would want you to read all 17 eventually, preferably in order, with notes. I'll add it to my list," Ancus said. "Right after don't get struck by lightning and figure out how to be two completely different kinds of king simultaneous. Start with the summary," Numa Marcius suggested. "The other 16 can wait until you have a quiet afternoon." "Do kings get quiet afternoons?" Not really. No, Ancus's first weeks as king consisted almost entirely of religious restoration, not the dramatic kind. No mystical consultations with springs, no visions, no divine manifestations, just systematic, practical attention to details that had been neglected during Tullus's 32 years of aggressive secularism. He started with the priesthoods, called every priest in Rome to the forum for an assessment of what needed repair, what needed replacement, what needed complete overhaul. The response was enthusiastic. Apparently, priests who'd been ignored for 3 decades had accumulated quite a lot of opinions about what needed fixing. The Vestals are fine. The representative of the Vestal Virgins reported, "Our fire has burned continuously, our devotion maintained, but we're exhausted. We've been covering responsibilities that should have been distributed more broadly. We need support staff." "Approved," Ancus said, making notes. Next, the representative of the Salii, the dancing priests of Mars, looked embarrassed. "We've become sloppy. Still perform our dances, still strike our shields, but without precision. We've been doing it because we're supposed to, not because we understand why it matters." "Understandable after 30 years of no one caring," Ancus said. "Can you retrain? Are there older Saluni who remember proper form?" "A few," the representative confirmed. "Very old. Possibly too old to dance, but definitely old enough to yell at us about doing it wrong." "Perfect," Ancus said. "Nothing motivates like elderly priests yelling at you. I'll arrange for comprehensive retraining. You'll dance properly, or you'll keep doing it until you do. The gods apparently care about precision, and I'd prefer not to test their patience on this." The Fetiala, priests of war and diplomacy, barely existed as a functional organization. Their leader, Marcus Valafarius, was perhaps 70, and looked like he'd been waiting decades for someone to remember his college existed. "We've maintained our knowledge," he reported with quiet dignity. "Passed down the rituals, preserved the ceremonies, never performed any of them because Tullus didn't believe in sacred diplomacy. But we're ready. We remember everything. We can do our jobs if anyone ever wants us to." Ancus felt a stab of sympathy for priests who'd maintained expertise in ceremonies no one had used for 30 years. "You're about to become very busy," he said. "Rome will declare no more wars without proper fetus process. You'll perform every ceremony exactly as Numa designed it. Can you do that?" "We can," Marcus Valerius said, and his voice carried decades of waiting for exactly this question. "We've been ready. We just needed someone to ask." The religious assessment took 2 full days. By the end, Ancus had a comprehensive list of what needed fixing, who needed training, which priests needed retirement, and which ceremonies had been so neglected that no one under 60 actually remembered how they were supposed to work. It was, essentially, an audit of Rome's entire spiritual infrastructure, the kind of detailed, unglamorous work that never made it into legends but absolutely determined whether anything else actually functioned. "This is a lot," Ancus said to Numa Marcius that evening, reviewing his notes. "This is what 30 years of neglect looks like," the old priest replied. "Your grandfather spent 43 years building this infrastructure. Tullus spent 32 years letting it atrophy. You get to spend the next several years rebuilding it. Exciting for you." "Is there a scroll about this?" Ancus asked. "Maybe scroll 12. What to do when the previous king ignored everything." "Scroll 14, actually," Numa Marcius said. "Your grandfather anticipated this possibility. He was pessimistic about human nature. The festivals had become perfunctory during Tullus's reign, still happening, technically, but without real attention or devotion. Just boxes being checked, obligations being fulfilled with the absolute minimum effort required to avoid divine wrath." Ancus went through the entire sacred calendar, festival by festival, and restored proper observance. The Lupercalia, the Wild Wolf Priest Festival, had become barely controlled chaos. Young men running through streets, hitting people with goatskin strips, all the religious significance lost in the excitement of ritualized mayhem. Ancus didn't eliminate the wildness. That was the point. But he insisted the priests actually perform the sacrifices correctly first, actually speak the proper prayers, actually acknowledge they were doing something sacred rather than just having an excuse to run around hitting people. But the hitting people part is the fun part. One young Lupercal priest protested. "You can still hit people," Ancus assured him, "after you perform the actual ceremony properly. Think of it as earning your hitting people privileges through religious devotion. That's actually fair," the priest admitted. The Robigalia, the sacrifice to prevent grain disease, had been reduced to quick perfunctory offering. just throwing something at a shrine and hoping the grain rust god wouldn't notice the lack of enthusiasm. Ancus expanded it back to proper ceremony. Full procession from the city to the shrine, 5 miles outside Rome, proper prayers, actual attention paid to the reason the ceremony existed. Rome's grain supply was too important to protect through half-hearted offerings to gods who might take offense at being treated like afterthoughts. The Vestalia, the festival of the hearth goddess, had become almost invisible. A few people remembering to honor Vesta, most of the city treating it as just another day. Ancus made it prominent again, declared it a city-wide festival, had every household participate in honoring domestic gods, made the everyday sacred something Rome actually acknowledged rather than assumed. This is a lot of festivals. One senator complained after 3 months of restored observances. We're celebrating something every other week. We were always supposed to be celebrating something every other week, Ancus replied. Numa designed the calendar that way. You just stopped noticing because Tullus didn't care, but the gods noticed. And I'd prefer they notice we're paying attention again before they express further opinions about our spiritual negligence. The senator had no response to that particular argument. No one wanted to argue against religious observance after watching what happened when religious observance was neglected. It was exhausting work. Not dramatic, no one would write epic poems about the king who restored proper festival observance, but essential. Rome's spiritual infrastructure had been neglected for 3 decades. Bringing it back to health required patient, systematic attention to hundreds of small details that individually seemed trivial, but collectively meant the difference between divine favor and divine lightning. 6 months into his reign, Ancus decided he needed to visit the grove beneath the Aventine Hill. He'd been avoiding it. Partly from uncertainty. He wasn't his grandfather, didn't have Numa's gift for divine communication, wasn't sure what he'd find in sacred spaces, but partly from the growing understanding that restoration required more than just administrative competence, required actually demonstrating personal devotion, not just mandating it for others. Also, several priests had mentioned it approximately 17 times, which suggested that perhaps he should stop avoiding the one thing his grandfather had been famous for. The grove was exactly as described in the stories. Ancient oaks, mossy stones, a spring flowing with eternal patience, the kind of place that felt separated from ordinary time, existing in some pocket of elsewhere that Rome had built around but never quite absorbed. Ancus sat beside the spring and tried to figure out what you were supposed to do when consulting goddesses you weren't entirely sure existed, and who definitely didn't talk to you the way they'd apparently talked to your grandfather. "I'm not my grandfather," he said finally, speaking to water and trees and the possibility of listening presence. "I don't hear voices in springs. I don't receive visions. I'm just someone trying to honor his legacy, while acknowledging that the world has changed and peace alone isn't sufficient anymore." The spring kept flowing. Patient, eternal, unimpressed by human uncertainty, and probably by the slightly awkward way he was sitting on mossy stones. "But I'm trying." Ancus continued, restoring what was neglected, making Rome spiritually healthy again, reading 17 scrolls of detailed instructions about religious ceremonies, trying to balance what my predecessors couldn't. I don't know if that's enough. I don't know if the gods care about effort or just results, but it's what I can offer. Silence, just water over stones and wind through leaves and the particular quiet that sacred spaces maintain when you're having one-sided conversations with them. So if you have opinions, Ancus added, about whether I'm doing this correctly, now would be a good time to share them. Burning bush situation, prophetic dream, even just a vaguely ominous rustle that I could interpret as divine guidance. Anything, really. The spring continued its eternal flow with perfect indifference to his requests. "Right," Ancus said, maintaining divine mystery. "Very professional. My grandfather said you were communicative, but perhaps that was a specific grandfather-goddess relationship, and I shouldn't expect the same level of service." He sat for perhaps an hour, waiting for something: guidance, wisdom, confirmation that he was doing the right things, maybe just a sense that someone was listening. Nothing came. No voice, no vision, no obvious sense of divine presence, just the continuing flow of water and the steady patience of ancient trees, and him having a somewhat one-sided conversation with nature. Finally, Ancus stood to leave, paused, looked back at the spring. "Thank you," he said, "for listening, if you listened, for existing, if you exist, for being patient with kings who aren't their grandfathers but are trying anyway. I'll keep visiting, even if you don't answer. Seems like the right thing to do." Then he walked back toward Rome, uncertain whether anything had happened, but somehow feeling less burdened anyway, walking back through the city, Ancus noticed changes his restoration had produced. Small things, mostly. Priests moving with more confidence, like they were doing something important, rather than maintaining obsolete traditions. Festivals happening with more attention, as if Rome had remembered that these things actually mattered. Citizens performing household devotions more carefully, taking the time to actually honor the gods rather than rushing through obligatory gestures. The temples were busier, not dramatically. This wasn't a religious revival exactly, just a return to normalcy. To understanding that the gods mattered, that sacred obligations couldn't be indefinitely postponed, that spiritual health was part of what kept cities functional, and kings unlightning struck. Numa Marcius found him in the forum that evening, reviewing reports about grain supplies and festival preparations in equal measure. "You visited the grove," the old priest said. Not a question. Somehow he knew. Possibly through priestly networks, or possibly because Ancus had leaves stuck to his robes. "I did," Ancus confirmed. "Didn't hear anything. Didn't receive wisdom. Just sat by water and had an awkward one-sided conversation with a spring that may or may not have been listening. That's normal," Numa Marcius said. Numa had a gift for divine communication that most people don't have. He heard things in running water that no one else could hear. Possibly because the goddess actually spoke to him. Possibly because he was very good at interpreting natural sounds as divine messages. Either way, it worked for him. "But not for me," Ancus said. "But visiting still matters," Numa Marcius replied. "Shows the gods you're trying. Shows Rome you take spiritual obligations seriously. Shows yourself that some things require attention even when they don't provide immediate tangible results or mystical visions." "So I'm doing it right?" Ancus asked. "The restoration? The festivals? The sitting by springs having one-sided conversations?" "You're doing it correctly," Numa Marcius replied. "Whether it's right, whether the gods approve, whether Rome benefits, whether balance is actually possible, that we'll discover over time. But correctly is sufficient to start. Correctness becomes rightness, through persistence, and not getting struck by lightning." The old priest left. Ancus sat in the forum as evening light faded, and thought about correctness and rightness and the difference between them, and also about how every conversation with priests eventually came back to lightning, which said something about Rome's recent history. He'd restored Rome's spiritual infrastructure, made the festivals work again, revived the priesthoods, shown the gods that Rome remembered them, honored them, understood that divine relationship required maintenance and actual attention rather than just assuming divine favor was automatic. But that was just the first half of his impossible task. The second half, maintaining Rome's strength, defending its borders, expanding when necessary, being warrior as well as priest that still waited. Balance wasn't just restoring what Tullus had neglected. Balance was maintaining that restoration while also being what Numa hadn't been. The hard part was just beginning. But at least Rome's spiritual foundation was solid again. At least the gods were being honored properly and appeared to be not displeased with current arrangements. At least the festivals worked, and the priests were competent. And the sacred infrastructure that Numa had built was functional again, and the chickens were still enthusiastically approving everything. That was something. Not everything, but something. And sometimes Ancus thought something was enough to build on, assuming you didn't get struck by lightning in the interim. The border dispute arrived in Ancus's second year as king, exactly when he'd started hoping Rome might avoid military conflict for a while longer. It began, as these things often did, with cattle. Specifically, with cattle that belonged to Roman farmers, but kept ending up on land that the city of Politorium claimed was theirs. Not stolen, just wandering across boundaries that had become conveniently ambiguous over the years of Roman expansion under Tullus. "The cows are confused," one farmer explained to the magistrate. "They don't understand property law, they just see grass." "The cows aren't confused," the magistrate replied. "The cows are exactly where they're supposed to be on Roman land. It's Politorium that's confused about where their territory ends and ours begins." "Should we explain this to the cows?" the farmer asked, "in case it helps?" "Please don't explain property law to the cows," the magistrate said wearily. "Just keep them fed and let us handle the diplomatic situation with the humans who are deliberately moving boundary markers." Politorium was a small Latin city about 10 miles from Rome. Not particularly important, not particularly threatening, just another settlement that had watched Rome grow from single city to regional power, and was trying to figure out how to maintain autonomy without getting absorbed or destroyed or having all their leadership torn apart by chariots, which was apparently something Rome did now. They'd been testing boundaries, literally and figuratively, for months. Moving marker stones, claiming streams as theirs that Rome considered Roman. Small provocations that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested. Politorium thought the new king might be weak, or at least less likely to immediately murder them than the previous king had been. The Roman farmers complained to their local magistrate. The magistrate complained to the Senate. The Senate brought it to Ancus with the clear expectation that Rome's fourth king would handle it the way Rome's third king had: send soldiers, establish dominance, make an example that would discourage future testing, possibly set something on fire. Ancus surprised them. "We'll use the fetiales," he announced during the Senate meeting discussing the dispute. Silence. The particular kind of confused silence that happens when someone suggests using a solution that technically exists but hasn't been used in so long that most people forgot it was an option. "The priests?" one senator asked carefully, trying to figure out if this was wisdom or naivety, or possibly a very elaborate joke. "The priests of sacred diplomacy," Ancus corrected. Numa established them specifically for situations like this. To make war when war becomes necessary, a religious act rather than just strategic choice. To ensure Rome doesn't enter violence casually or because we're annoyed about confused cows. But we don't need priests to tell us Politorium is violating our borders. Another senator objected. "We need soldiers to remind them where those borders are, preferably with swords." "We need both," Ancus said patiently. "We need the fetiales to formally declare that Rome has been wronged, that we've sought peaceful resolution, that the gods witness our grievance as legitimate. Then, if Politorium refuses satisfaction, we send soldiers with divine sanction rather than just royal anger and irritation about cattle. That takes time." "Good," Ancus interrupted. "Taking time means we're not rushing into violence, means we've actually tried alternatives, means when we do fight, if we fight, it's because fighting became necessary, not because it was the easiest solution or because we were bored." "We're not bored," a senator protested. "We're protecting Roman property and Roman dignity." "Even better reason to do it properly then," Ancus said. "If we're fighting for legitimate reasons, we should have no problem proving those reasons are legitimate through proper ceremony. Unless you think the gods might disagree with our grievance, in which case we definitely shouldn't be starting a war." No one could argue with that logic without essentially admitting they thought Rome's grievance might not actually be justified, which would be politically awkward. The Senate debated. Half thought Ancus was being admirably restrained and properly religious, like his grandfather but with more practical awareness. Half thought he was being weak and using ceremony to disguise indecision, and possibly had been spending too much time talking to springs. Both halves eventually agreed to let him try his approach, mostly because refusing the king's first military decision seemed politically unwise, and also they were curious to see what the fetiales actually did after 30 years of forced retirement. Ancus called for the fetiales. 4 elderly priests who'd maintained their college through Tullus's reign, despite having nothing to actually do except preserve knowledge that no one wanted, and practice ceremonies that no one requested. They arrived looking simultaneously honoured and terrified, finally being needed after decades of obsolescence, but also aware that performing incorrectly after such a long gap would reflect badly on the entire concept of sacred diplomacy, and possibly result in either divine disapproval or just general embarrassment. "Walk me through the process," Ancus said, meeting with them privately before any public ceremony. "Not the theory, the actual practical steps. What happens, what order, what I need to do, how many different herbs are involved." The head fetialis, his name was Marcus Valerius, and he was perhaps 70, had been trained by priests who'd learnt directly from Numa, explained the ancient ritual with obvious relief that someone was finally asking, and hadn't forgotten they existed. "First, we travel to Politorium's border carrying sacred herbs, vervain, specifically, which grows on the Capitoline Hill. We announce Rome's grievance publicly, calling on Jupiter to witness. We give Politorium 33 days to provide satisfaction, to return the disputed territory, acknowledge Roman claims, make appropriate restitution for any injuries including confused cattle." 33 days? Ancus repeated. "That's very specific. Is there significance to that number, or did Numa just like how it sounded?" "Sacred number," Marcus Valerius explained. 11 times 3, significant in ways that have been forgotten but remain important. Also possibly because 33 days is long enough that people actually have time to think rather than just reacting emotionally, which might have been your grandfather's real goal. That sounds like him. Ancus admitted. Practical wisdom disguised as religious mystery. And if they refuse after 33 days, we return to Rome, report to you and the Senate, and formally recommend war. Then, and this is the critical part, we throw a spear into Politorium's territory. Not metaphorically. Literally throw a physical spear across their border. That's the sacred declaration. That's when war officially begins. We throw a spear at them, Ancus said slowly. Into their territory, Marcus Valerius clarified. Not at them personally. That would be rude. We're declaring sacred war, not just being aggressive. And this whole process is necessary, if you want divine approval for warfare. Yes, Marcus Valerius said. If you want to fight without divine sanction, you can skip the ceremony and just send soldiers whenever you want. Worked fine for Tullus for 30 years, until it didn't. Ancus finished. Until it didn't. Marcus Valerius agreed. Quite dramatically didn't, in fact. Ancus considered this. It was elaborate, time-consuming, full of specific requirements that seemed arbitrary. It was also exactly the kind of process that forced everyone to pause, to actually think, to make war a deliberate choice rather than an impulsive reaction to inconvenient cows. Let's do it, he said, properly. Every detail exactly as Numa designed it. I want Politorium to understand that Rome declaring war now means something different than it did under Tullus. Your grandfather will be proud, Marcus Valerius said quietly, from wherever he watches, probably from a comfortable cloud with good viewing angles. Let's hope he's watching, Ancus replied, and that he approves of me adapting his process to situations he never had to handle, because everyone was too peaceful during his reign. The facial ceremony began 3 days later. Marcus Valerius led the college to Politorium's border, accompanied by a small honor guard but no army. They wore their sacred robes, ancient garments that had been maintained through decades of disuse. Smelling slightly of storage herbs and optimism, Ancus accompanied them, despite advice that kings didn't usually participate in facial ceremonies, and also that it might look weak to show up without an actual army. I want Politorium to see that Rome's king personally cares about proper process, Ancus explained, that this isn't just ritual theatre but actual serious diplomacy backed by someone who could send soldiers but is choosing not to yet. They stopped at the boundary marker that Politorium had supposedly moved. The Fetiales gathered sacred herbs from a pouch Marcus Valerius carried. Vervain harvested from the Capitoline hill, touched to Jupiter's temple, blessed with appropriate prayers and probably some additional protective charms just in case. Hear me, Jupiter, Marcus Valerius called out, his voice carrying across the open ground toward Politorium's walls. Hear me, citizens of Politorium. Hear me, confused cattle who are probably not paying attention but are technically part of this dispute. Rome speaks through sacred office with divine witness concerning grievances that require resolution. The Politorians had gathered on their walls to watch. This was unusual enough. Roman priests performing ancient ceremonies instead of Roman soldiers performing aggressive conquest. That curiosity overcame caution. Rome claims that Politorium has moved boundary markers. Marcus Valerius continued, following the ancient formula precisely. That cattle rightfully belonging to Roman citizens have been confused by ambiguous territorial claims. That streams flowing through Roman territory have been claimed by Politorium without justification or proper documentation. These grievances are true and just, witnessed by Jupiter and all gods who maintain justice between cities, and also between cities and their livestock. He paused, giving weight to the words, letting the sacred nature of the declaration settle. Also giving Politorium time to process that Rome was actually doing this, was actually performing elaborate religious ceremony instead of just showing up with swords. Politorium has 33 days to provide satisfaction, Marcus Valerius said, to return disputed territory, to acknowledge Roman boundaries, to make restitution for violation of Roman rights and agricultural confusion. If satisfaction is provided, Rome will be content and peace will continue. If satisfaction is refused, then war will follow, not from Roman choice, but from Politorian obstinacy and poor decision-making. It was formal, old-fashioned language. The kind of speech that sounded archaic even in its own time, using phrases that had been passed down through generations of fetal priests who maintained tradition precisely because it was tradition, and also because no one had told them they could update the wording. But it worked. The formality made it serious, made it clear that Rome wasn't casually threatening but formally requesting, made Politorium understand that refusing meant actual consequences, witnessed by actual gods, sanctioned by actual divine authority, and not just by a king who felt like conquering something today. The Politorian leaders, visible on the walls, close enough to hear, exchanged uncertain glances. They'd expected Roman soldiers, expected aggression, expected the kind of immediate military response that Tullus would have provided, probably with fire and possibly with theatrical violence. This was different. Strange. requiring different response, and also possibly research into what the Fetiadals actually were, and whether this was normal Roman behaviour, or just this particular king being weird. 33 days, the Politorian chief called back, his voice uncertain. We hear Rome's grievance. We will consider our response, and possibly count whether 33 days is actually significant or just sounds official. It's significant, Marcus Valerius called back helpfully. 11 times 3. Very sacred number. You're welcome to use the time to think about that. The Fetiales planted a spear in the ground, marking the spot where the declaration had been made. Packed the sacred herbs back into their pouch with careful attention to proper storage procedures. Turned and walked back toward Rome with the dignified slowness of priests who understood that rushing would undermine the ceremony's gravity. And also they were all fairly old and rushing wasn't really an option anyway. Ancus walked with them, silent until they were well out of Politorian hearing. Do you think they'll provide satisfaction? He asked Marcus Valerius. Probably not, the old priest replied honestly. They've been testing Rome for months. They think you're weak because you haven't immediately attacked them. 33 days will just convince them they can push further. So we'll end up at war anyway? Almost certainly, Marcus Valerius confirmed. But we'll go to war correctly, with divine sanction, with clear conscience, with the understanding that we tried peaceful resolution and they refused. That matters more than people think. Wars fought with proper ceremony are different from wars fought through casual aggression. The gods notice the difference, so do soldiers, so does Rome itself. Also, it makes the eventual victory feel more justified, and less like we're just being aggressive bullies who wanted an excuse. And if we lose? Ancus asked. Then the gods didn't support our grievance, and we probably shouldn't have started the war, Marcus Valerius said. But I'm assuming we won't lose, because you're not actually weak, you're just not immediately violent, which is different. They walked back through Rome's territory in comfortable silence. The ceremony was done. Now came the waiting, 33 days for Politorium to make their choice, for Rome to prepare for the likely outcome, for Ancus to discover whether sacred process actually changed anything beyond making violence feel more justified. Politorium's response came on the 32nd day, not through the Fetiales, not through proper diplomatic channels, but through action. They raided 3 more Roman farms, took cattle, burned grain stores, and left a message that essentially said, Rome can have satisfaction when Rome is strong enough to take it. Also, we counted, and 33 days is not that long actually. It was insult compounded on injury. Exactly the kind of provocation that required response unless Rome wanted to look completely impotent. The Senate met in emergency session. The mood was no longer cautious or philosophical or curious about ancient ceremonies. Several senators who'd questioned Ancus's fetial approach now felt vindicated. See, they said, diplomacy doesn't work with people who mistake restraint for weakness and proper process for inability to fight. We gave them 33 days, one senator said, almost shouting. Sacred days, blessed by Jupiter, witnessed by gods. We performed ancient ceremonies. We threw herbs at them ceremonially. They responded by burning Roman property and stealing Roman cattle and probably laughing about how weak we look. We did throw herbs at them, another senator agreed. That was our opening move. Herbs. Sacred herbs. A third senator corrected. There's a difference. They still laughed at us. Ancus sat quietly while the Senate vented its frustration. Let them express anger. Let them feel heard. Let the emotional energy exhaust itself before introducing practical considerations. Also, he was privately amused by how invested everyone had become in the sacred herbs, which suggested the ceremony had at least made an impression even if not the intended one. Finally, when the shouting subsided to manageable grumbling, he spoke. You're right, he said simply. Politorium has refused satisfaction. They've compounded initial injury with deliberate insult. They've made it clear they don't respect proper process or sacred ceremony, or Rome's attempts at peaceful resolution. War is now necessary, not because we want it, but because they've made peaceful resolution impossible, and also because they laughed at our herbs. The Senate nodded approval. This was what they'd wanted to hear, including acknowledgement of the herb-related mockery. But, Ancus continued, we do this correctly. We complete the fetal process. We throw the sacred spear. We declare war with divine sanction rather than just royal anger and wounded dignity about agricultural raids. That way, when we win, and we will win, it's not just conquest, it's justice executed with religious propriety. The gods will have witnessed that we tried everything, that Politorium refused everything, that war became the only remaining option. More ceremony? Someone objected wearily. They've already refused our initial ceremony. What's the point of additional ceremony? The point, Ancus said patiently, is completion. We started the process properly. We'll finish it properly. The spear throwing takes 5 minutes. Then we mobilize, march, and settle this the way Politorium apparently wants it settled through force. But force sanctioned by gods, blessed by proper ritual, executed with the understanding that violence isn't casual entertainment but serious last resort, that we pursued only after exhausting alternatives. And if they laugh at the spear too? Someone asked. Then they'll learn that sacred spears are followed by significantly less symbolic weapons. Ancus replied, the ceremony doesn't make us weak, it makes us right. There's a difference, and Politorium is about to discover what that difference looks like. The Senate agreed, mostly because the king was giving them what they wanted with only minor ceremonial delay, and also because everyone was curious to see what the spear-throwing ceremony actually involved. The Fetiales were summoned. The formal declaration of war would happen the next day, with all appropriate witnesses, followed immediately by military mobilization and probable aggressive demonstration that Rome's restraint had been choice rather than incapacity. That night, Ancus sat in his modest house. He'd refused the palace, preferred to live like a citizen rather than a monarch, partly from principle, and partly because palaces had a recent history of being struck by lightning, and he wasn't taking chances, and thought about his first war as king. He'd tried diplomacy, tried proper process, tried giving Politorium every opportunity to resolve things peacefully, performed ceremonies, invoked gods, declared grievances formally, waited the sacred 33 days, and they'd responded with contempt, with raids, with the assumption that Rome's new king was weak because he consulted priests before deploying soldiers. Now they'd learn otherwise. Learn that balance didn't mean weakness, that religious propriety didn't exclude military competence, that Numa's grandson could honor sacred process while also being perfectly capable of conquest, that the king who threw sacred herbs could also throw considerably more aggressive things when circumstances required. It wasn't what Ancus had hoped for. He'd wanted to avoid war entirely, wanted to prove that Rome could expand through alliance and diplomacy, rather than constant violence and agricultural raids. But the world didn't always cooperate with what you hoped for. Sometimes the world required force. The question wasn't whether to use it. Politorium had made that choice for him, but whether to use it wisely, justly, with proper understanding of what violence cost, and why it was necessary. Tomorrow, he'd throw the sacred spear. Then he'd mobilize Rome's army and teach Politorium that mistaking ceremony for weakness was a fatal miscalculation, and also that sacred herbs were just the opening act. Balance meant knowing when to pray and when to fight. Politorium was about to discover which one Ancus had chosen, and probably regret laughing at the herbs. The spear-throwing ceremony happened at dawn in the Forum, with half of Rome watching. Marcus Valerius stood at the center, holding a spear that had been blessed, consecrated, touched to Jupiter's altar, and possibly given a stern talking to about representing Rome properly. Beside him, Ancus stood in armor. Not priest's robes now, but warrior's bronze, both aspects visible simultaneously, both sides of balance demonstrated. The king who consulted springs and threw sacred herbs and also knew how to hold a spear for purposes beyond ceremony. Jupiter, witness, Marcus Valerius called out. All gods who maintain justice between cities, witness. All Romans who doubted whether this would actually lead anywhere, witness. Rome sought peaceful resolution. Politorium refused. Rome offered satisfaction through sacred process. Politorium responded with insult, violence, and mockery of our herbs. Therefore, with divine sanction and extremely just cause, Rome declares war. He handed the spear to Ancus, the king who would also be warrior, the grandson of Numa, who would also be what Numa hadn't been, someone who could maintain spiritual integrity, while also being perfectly capable of aggressive military action. Ancus took the spear, felt its weight, understood that this moment symbolized everything his reign was trying to accomplish. Religious propriety and military action, sacred process and practical force, balance between extremes that both his predecessors had failed to maintain. He threw the spear toward the direction of Politorium. It arced through morning air and landed in earth that represented enemy territory. And Rome's fourth war, first under Ancus, first conducted with full fetial ceremony in over 30 years, officially began. The crowd cheered, not the wild enthusiasm that had greeted Tullus's wars, but something more measured, approval of necessity, support for justice, understanding that this wasn't glory-seeking, but reasonable response to unreasonable provocation, also possibly some satisfaction that the people who'd laughed at the herbs were about to receive consequences. Ancus looked at the spear standing in the forum earth and thought, this is balance, not avoiding conflict, but ensuring conflict happens only when necessary and only with proper sanction. Not weakness, but restraint followed by appropriate force. Politorium had made this necessary. Now Rome would demonstrate what properly sanctioned force looked like when delivered by a king who'd given them every chance to avoid it. The army mobilized. Rome marched. The priests blessed the banners. The soldiers sharpened their weapons. The sacred chickens presumably approved because they approved everything. And Ancus Marcius, Numa's grandson, began learning what his grandfather had never needed to know: how to wage war while maintaining spiritual integrity, how to conquer without losing divine favor, how to be both priest and warrior simultaneously. It was, he was discovering, even harder than he'd feared, but also possible. Maybe, if he didn't make too many mistakes, and if the gods appreciated the effort, even when the execution was imperfect, the war began. Balance would be tested, and Politorium would learn that Rome's restraint had been generosity, not incapacity. The hard way, unfortunately. For them. The war with Politorium lasted 6 weeks. Not because Politorium was particularly strong or well defended or had access to clever military strategies. They weren't, and they didn't. The war lasted 6 weeks because Ancus insisted on doing everything methodically, with proper planning, with attention to logistics and supply lines and all the unglamorous details that determined whether armies functioned or just became large groups of hungry, disorganized men standing in fields wondering what to do next. Rome's army marched to Politorium with what one veteran soldier described as suspicious amounts of preparation. Scouts sent ahead, supply wagons properly loaded, clear chain of command, specific objectives defined before anyone left the city. The kind of organized military campaign that suggested someone had actually thought about what they were doing, rather than just pointing soldiers at a target and hoping for the best. This is different. One veteran told a younger soldier during the march, Tullus would have just marched us straight at them, fought immediately, dealt with supply problems as they arose. Romulus probably would have fought them personally, and expected us to figure out the details. This king actually has a plan. Is that good or bad? The younger soldier asked. Ask me after we see if the plan works, the veteran replied. Plans are great right up until they meet actual combat, then they're suggestions at best. The siege of Politorium began with another ceremony. Because of course it did. Ancus had the Fetiogieles perform a formal declaration at Politorium's walls, announcing Rome's intentions, calling on the gods to witness the justice of Rome's cause, giving Politorium one final chance to surrender peacefully and avoid the destruction that was about to happen. We're already surrounded by your army, the Politorian leader called down from the walls. Your final chance feels somewhat less than sincere. It's religiously required, Antus called back. We're offering the option. What you do with it is your choice, but we had to offer, so if we surrender now, you'll just leave? No, Ancus admitted. We'll still occupy your city and incorporate your territory, but we'll do it peacefully, without burning everything and killing everyone. Significantly better option from your perspective. Politorium considered, debated among themselves, looked at the Roman army, larger than their own, better equipped, more organized, led by a king who'd given them 33 days to avoid this, and they'd responded by mocking his herbs. They surrendered. The siege ended before it really began. Politorium opened their gates, acknowledged Rome's territorial claims, agreed to be absorbed into Rome's expanding domain. The Roman soldiers, who'd been prepared for actual combat, were vaguely disappointed. We marched all the way here and they just gave up, one soldier complained. You're complaining about not dying? His companion asked. I'm complaining about carrying all this equipment for 6 weeks only to stand around while priests perform ceremonies and kings negotiate. This is not what I signed up for. You signed up for military service. This is military service. Sometimes it's fighting, sometimes it's standing around feeling disappointed that no one attacked you. I preferred Tullus, the first soldier grumbled. At least under Tullus we fought things. Under Tullus we also got betrayed by allies and watched our king die in flames, the companion pointed out. Maybe standing around doing nothing isn't the worst outcome. The question now was what to do with Politorium itself. Ancus called a council of war himself, his senior commanders, a few senators who'd accompanied the campaign, and Marcus Valerius because apparently priests were now part of military planning. We have options, Ancus said, looking at a rough map of the region drawn on a wax tablet. Option 1, destroy Politorium completely. Tear down the walls, burn the buildings. Make an example like Tullus did with Alba Longa. Sends a strong message about defying Rome. Strong message, one commander agreed. Also expensive and time-consuming, and we still need to figure out what to do with all the people who live there. Option 2, Ancus continued, occupy Politorium. Station Roman soldiers, install Roman administration, keep the city intact but under our control, maintains infrastructure, allows trade, gives us a permanent military presence in the region, requires permanent garrison, another commander pointed out. Troops stationed away from Rome indefinitely. Also Politorium might resent occupation and cause problems. Option 3. Ancus said slowly, thinking through the idea even as he spoke. Bring them to Rome. Silence. Everyone trying to process what that would mean. Bring them to Rome, one senator repeated carefully. You mean all of them? The entire population of Politorium? Most of them, Ancus clarified. Anyone who wants to stay can stay. Farm the land, maintain the region. But we offer Politorium's citizens Roman citizenship. Give them land in Rome, integrate them into our city, like we did with the Sabines under Romulus, like we did with Alba Longa under Tullus. Alba Longa was destroyed, someone pointed out. Completely. We didn't give them a choice. Which is why I'm suggesting we offer choice this time, Ancus said. Destruction didn't make the Albans love Rome, it made them compliant through fear. I'd prefer integration through incentive. Make Roman citizenship valuable. Make people want to join us rather than forcing them. Marcus Valerius nodded slowly. Your grandfather would approve. He believed Rome should grow through alliance and inclusion. Make the city worth joining. Tullus would think it's weak, one commander countered. Offering choice to defeated enemies. They lost. We should dictate terms, not negotiate options. Tullus died screaming in flames. Ancus said mildly. I'm not convinced his approach is the model we want to follow exactly. We can be strong without being unnecessarily cruel. We can expand without creating populations that hate us and wait for opportunities to rebel. The council debated. Some thought offering choice was wise policy that would make integration smoother. Others thought it was dangerous precedent. Defeated enemies should submit completely, not negotiate terms. Still others worried about Rome's capacity to absorb another population when they'd already doubled in size under Tullus and the city's infrastructure was straining. Finally Ancus made the decision. Politorium's citizens would be offered Roman citizenship and land on the Aventine Hill. Those who wanted to come would be welcomed. Those who wanted to stay could remain in their territory but under Roman administration. The city's walls would be torn down, not destroyed completely, just made indefensible so Politorium couldn't be used as a military base against Rome. A compromise between Numa's inclusion and Tullus's destruction. We'll see if generosity works better than terror, Ancus said. If it doesn't, we can always become more aggressive later. But starting aggressive and trying to become generous afterward is significantly harder. The offer was presented to Politorium citizens the next day. Ancus stood in their forum, smaller than Rome's, less impressive, but serviceable, and addressed the assembled population with the particular awkwardness of someone explaining why conquest could actually be an opportunity, if you looked at it from the right angle. You fought Rome, he began. Well, you considered fighting Rome, then wisely decided not to actually do the fighting part. That was good judgment. We appreciate good judgment. Some nervous laughter from the crowd. No one was entirely sure where this was going. Rome is expanding, Ancus continued. That's not a threat, it's just reality. We're growing, and growth means incorporating neighbouring territories. You can resist that and eventually be destroyed, or you can join voluntarily and benefit from being part of something larger. We're offering you the second option. He paused, looking out at faces that were skeptical and worried, and calculating whether this was genuine offer or trap. Here's what we're offering, Ancus said. Full Roman citizenship. Not partial, not conditional. Full rights and responsibilities. Land on the Aventine Hill in Rome itself. You'll be Romans, not conquered subjects. Your gods will be honoured in Roman temples. Your families will intermarry with Roman families. Your children will be Roman children with all the opportunities that provides. And if we refuse, someone called out, you can stay here, Ancus replied. Farm your land, maintain your homes. But Politorium as an independent city is finished. We'll tear down the walls so you can't use them against us. We'll install Roman administrators to collect taxes and maintain order. You'll be part of Roman territory whether you're physically in Rome or not. The question is whether you want to be Romans in Rome with citizenship and opportunity, or Romans in Politorium subject to distant authority with limited rights. It was a generous offer by the standards of early Italian warfare. Most defeated cities got destruction or subjugation. Ancus was offering integration as equals, or at least as equal as conquered peoples ever became. Why? Another voice asked. Why not just take everything and force us to comply? Because force creates resentment, Andros said honestly, and resentment creates rebellion, and rebellion creates problems I'd rather avoid. I want Rome to be strong enough that people want to join us, want to be part of what we're building. Forcing you makes us powerful through fear. Convincing you makes us powerful through loyalty. The second one is harder but more sustainable. He let that sink in. You have 3 days to decide, Ancus said. Discuss with your families. Think about what you want your future to look like. We'll accept anyone who chooses Rome. We'll leave alone anyone who chooses to stay. No punishment for choosing either way. This isn't a trick, it's an actual offer. The crowd dispersed uncertainly. Some looked hopeful. Others looked suspicious. Most looked like they needed to think, which was exactly what Ancus wanted. People making deliberate choice rather than just reacting emotionally to conquest. That was a good speech, Marcus Valerius said quietly as they walked back toward the Roman camp. Your grandfather's idealism combined with practical awareness of how humans actually make decisions. Will it work? Ancus asked. Some will come, maybe half. Those who see opportunity and want to take it. The rest will stay and complain about Roman occupation but accept it, because the alternative is worse. Either way, you'll have successfully integrated Politorium without creating a population that actively wants to murder you. That's better than most conquest outcomes. Over the next 3 days, Politorium's citizens debated among themselves. Families argued. Young people wanted to go. Rome was larger, more opportunities, more exciting than small city life. Older people wanted to stay, this was home, familiar, where their ancestors were buried. Merchants calculated economic opportunities. Farmers worried about leaving their land. Everyone tried to figure out if Ancus's offer was genuine, or if there was a hidden cost that would become apparent only after they'd committed. In the end, roughly half of Politorium chose to relocate to Rome. Not evenly distributed. More young families than old. More merchants than farmers. More people who'd felt constrained by small city life than those who'd been content. The kind of self-selection that actually worked in Rome's favour, bringing people who wanted change rather than dragging along people who resented it. The migration was organised methodically. Rome provided wagons, supplies, guides, made the journey as easy as possible, treated the relocating Politorians as future citizens rather than conquered subjects. Another signal that the offer was genuine, that Roman citizenship actually meant something beyond just submission to conquest. The remaining Politorians, those who chose to stay, watched the exodus with mixed feelings, relief that they weren't being forced to leave, worry about what Politorium would be like with half its population gone, uncertainty about Roman administration, and whether they'd regret not taking the opportunity when it was offered. Ancus left a small garrison to maintain order and begin the wall dismantling. Not destruction, just removal of military fortifications. Left the buildings intact, the farms functional, the basic infrastructure operational. Politorium would continue existing as a town, just not as an independent city-state. Then he led the Roman army and the Politorian refugees back toward Rome, thinking about integration and identity, and the challenge of making conquered peoples actually feel Roman, rather than just legally Roman. The Politorians arrived at Rome and saw, perhaps for the first time, how much larger it was than their small city. 7 hills covered in buildings. Walls encompassing territory that dwarfed Politorium. The Forum bustling with activity. Temples impressive enough to suggest Rome's gods were taken seriously. The sense of a city that was growing, expanding, becoming something significant in the region. Some of the Politorians looked excited. Others looked overwhelmed. A few looked like they were reconsidering their choice but were too far along to back out now. Ancus had prepared the Aventine Hill for their arrival. Not elaborately, Rome didn't have unlimited resources, but adequately. Plots marked out for housing. Space designated for Politorian temples, so they could maintain their own religious practices. Clear organization rather than just pointing at empty land and saying, "Figure it out. The Aventine Hill will be your home," Ancus announced to the arriving Politorians. "Build your houses, establish your temples, create your community. You're Romans now. That means responsibilities, taxes, military service when needed, participation in Roman festivals and civic duties. But it also means rights, legal protection, access to Roman markets, voice in Roman decisions through your representatives. Will we be treated as equal to original Romans?" someone asked. "Or will we always be those people from Politorium who had to be conquered?" That, Ancus said honestly, depends partly on us and partly on you. Rome will treat you as equal citizens legally. Whether you feel equal socially depends on how well integration works. Marry into Roman families, learn Roman customs while maintaining your own, participate in city life, make yourselves valuable. The Sabinins did it under Romulus. They integrated so thoroughly that now you can't distinguish Sabinin Romans from original Romans. You can do the same. It was blunt advice, but useful. The Politorians who'd chosen Rome had essentially bet on integration being possible. Now they'd discover whether that bet paid off. The Alban refugees, who'd been settled on the same Aventine hill under Tullus, watched the new arrivals with mixed feelings. Competition for space, yes, but also solidarity of people who'd made similar choice, who understood what it was like to become Roman after being something else. "Welcome to the Aventine," one Alban said to a Politorian family settling nearby. "The hill of people who used to be from somewhere else. Is it good here?" The Politorian asked nervously. "It's Rome," the Alban replied. "It's complicated. It's crowded. It's nothing like where we came from. But it's also opportunity and protection and being part of something bigger than small city life. You'll adjust." We did. The Aventine Hill filled with Politorian houses over the following months. Small neighborhoods forming, temples being built, markets being established. The particular chaos of rapid settlement, of people figuring out how to live somewhere new while maintaining enough of what they'd known to feel like they hadn't completely lost themselves, and to get visited frequently, checking on integration, resolving disputes, making sure the Politorians were being treated fairly by longer-term Romans. It was administrative work, unglamorous, time-consuming, the kind of governance that never made it into dramatic stories, but determined whether expansion actually worked or just created problems. "Your grandfather would be pleased," Numa Marcius said during one of these visits. He believed Rome's strength was inclusion, that we should grow by making people want to join us rather than forcing them through conquest alone. But Tullus grew Rome faster through conquest, Ancus pointed out. Forced integration of Alba Longa doubled our size in months rather than years, and created a population that resented Rome for decades. Numa Marcius replied, "Your approach is slower but more stable. These Politorians chose to come. They'll integrate more smoothly because they made the decision themselves. That's worth the extra time." Ancus hoped he was right. Hoped that offering choice would create loyal citizens rather than resentful subjects. Hoped that Rome could expand without becoming the thing conquered peoples feared and hated. It was an experiment, a gamble on human nature, and the possibility that generosity could be strength rather than weakness. Time would tell whether it worked. The integration proceeded slowly, imperfectly, but without major disaster. There were tensions. Naturally, competition for market access, disputes over land boundaries, Roman families looking down on Politorian families as conquered peoples, Politorian families maintaining separate identity longer than Rome preferred, the usual frictions of mixing populations who'd been separate for generations. But there was also intermarriage, trade relationships forming, children of Romans and Politorians becoming friends before they were old enough to care about which city their parents came from. The gradual blurring of boundaries that happened when people actually lived together rather than just existing in proximity. 1 year after Politorium's conquest, Ancus stood on the Aventine Hill and looked at the neighborhood that had formed. It was distinct. You could tell this was where the Politorians lived, that they maintained some separate identity, but it was also integrated. Roman and Politorian families living side by side, shops serving mixed populations, temples to both sets of gods existing companionably near each other. Not perfect integration, but functional integration, the kind that could deepen over time if maintained properly. "This is working," Ancus said to no one in particular. "Slowly, imperfectly, but working." "You sound surprised," Marcus Valerius observed. The old Fetalis had accompanied Ancus on the visit, ostensibly to check on religious integration, but mostly because he was curious about whether the experiment had succeeded. "I am surprised," Anticorus admitted. "I expected more resistance, more resentment, more problems with making conquered peoples feel Roman." "You offered them choice," Marcus Valerius said, "and you followed through on your promises. They're not Roman because you forced them. They're Roman because they chose to be, and you made that choice worth making. That's different from how most conquest works." Ancus watched Politorian children playing with Roman children in the street below, completely unconcerned with which city their parents had come from. That was the future of integration, not the parents who remembered being separate. but the children who grew up not knowing any other way. This is what balance looks like, he said quietly. Not avoiding conquest entirely like Numa. Not conquering brutally like Tullus, but conquering when necessary, and integrating generously afterward. Taking territory but making the people want to stay. Slower than pure conquest, Marcus Valerius agreed, but more sustainable. Rome will remember you as the king who made expansion human rather than just strategic. Will they remember that as a good thing? Ancus asked. Depends who wins the next few wars, Marcus Valerius said with the blunt honesty of very old priests. Success is remembered kindly. Failure is remembered as weakness regardless of intentions. But you're doing it right either way. That matters independent of outcomes. They walked back down the Aventine hill together, past Politorian houses and Alban houses, and houses that were just Roman now, because the distinction had become too complicated to maintain. Past temples to gods from 3 different cities who apparently didn't mind sharing sacred space. Past markets where merchants from various origins traded with customers who didn't care where anyone was from, as long as the goods were quality and the prices were fair. This was Rome now. Diverse, complicated, growing through combination of force and choice, becoming something larger than any single city, something made from mixing populations who'd once been separate. It was working. Not perfectly. Never perfectly. But adequately enough that Rome was stronger for it, larger for it, more complex and interesting and sustainable for it. Balance. Integration. Growth through inclusion rather than just conquest. Numa would have approved. Tullus would have thought it was weak. Ancus thought it was simply practical. Make people want to be Roman, and you get loyal citizens. Force people to be Roman and you get subjects who wait for opportunities to rebel. Better to have the first kind than the second. Even if it took longer. Even if it required patience and administration, and careful attention to making conquered peoples feel like they'd made good choice rather than bad mistake. The Aventine hill filled with voices speaking Latin with Politorian accents, making Rome a little larger, a little more diverse, a little more like the empire it would eventually become. One conquest at a time, one integration at a time, one choice at a time. Building Rome, not just through force, but through the harder work of making force feel like opportunity. The Tiber was Rome's oldest companion and most consistent problem. It flowed through the territory Rome controlled, providing fresh water, transportation, natural defense, but it also divided Rome from the lands beyond, specifically from Etruscan territory to the north and west, from the salt marshes at its mouth, from everything that existed on the far bank and might as well have been on the moon for how accessible it was. Crossing the Tiber required boats, or swimming, if you were particularly brave and didn't mind the current or the occasional body that floated past from upstream violence, or waiting for the rare shallow spots during dry season when you could wade across and hope you didn't slip on rocks and drown embarrassingly. This was fine when Rome was small and self-contained. Less fine now that Rome controlled territory on both sides of the river, and was trying to function as a regional power rather than just a single city-state. We need a bridge, Ancus announced to the Senate in his 4th year as king. The Senate looked at him with the particular expression of people who agreed with a proposal, but had absolutely no idea how to accomplish it. A bridge, one senator repeated slowly, across the Tiber, which is wide, and has current, and floods periodically. Yes, Ancus confirmed all of those things, but also crossable if we build proper infrastructure instead of just hoping the boats don't sink. Has anyone built a bridge across something this large before? Another senator asked. Probably, Ancus said, somewhere. Other civilizations exist, and presumably some of them have encountered rivers and solved the crossing problem. We should be capable of doing what others have already done, and possibly doing it better. Who would build it? Engineers, Ancus replied. We have people who understand construction, who've built walls and aqueducts and various structures that don't fall down immediately. We apply that knowledge to bridge building. How different can it be? Significantly different, someone pointed out. Walls don't have currents flowing under them trying to wash away their foundations. Then we'll learn, Ancus said, with the stubborn optimism of someone who'd decided something was possible and would discover the actual difficulties through direct experience. We'll study existing bridges, consult with engineers, probably make mistakes and fix them, and eventually we'll have a bridge. Rome is growing. We need infrastructure that matches our size. The Senate debated. Building a bridge was expensive, technically challenging, and would require resources that could be used for other things like more military campaigns, or additional temples, or just general city maintenance. But it was also obviously useful. A permanent crossing point would facilitate trade, military movement and communication in ways boats never could. Finally, they authorized the project with the understanding that if it failed catastrophically and washed away into the sea, everyone would agree to never speak of it again. Ancus left the Senate meeting and thought, I have absolutely no idea how to build a bridge. Time to find someone who does. The search for bridge-building expertise took several months. Rome consulted with Etruscan engineers. The Etruscans were generally more advanced in engineering and architecture, had built impressive structures in their cities, might know something about crossing rivers permanently. They were also Rome's sometime enemies and sometime trading partners, which made the consultation politically complicated. You want to build a bridge, the Etruscan engineer said, visiting Rome to assess the project. His name was Vel, and he had the particular confidence of someone who'd built things that hadn't fallen down. Across the Tiber. At this point, he looked at the proposed crossing location, the narrowest point near Rome, but still roughly 50 yards wide. Yes, Ancus confirmed. Is it possible? Possible? Vel laughed. Anything is possible with enough money and willingness to accept failure. Is it advisable? That's a different question. What's the challenge? The Tiber floods. Vel explained, gesturing at the river. Every spring, water level rises significantly. Whatever you build needs to survive that, or you'll be rebuilding constantly. Also, the current is strong, will try to undermine any foundations you place. Also, Rome doesn't have extensive experience with large-scale engineering projects, so you'll be learning as you go, which traditionally increases the chance of catastrophic failure. But possible, Ancus said. But possible, Vel agreed. If you're willing to invest resources and accept that the first version might not work perfectly and require adjustment, most large projects do. They walked along the riverbank, Vel examining the terrain, the water depth, the soil composition, making calculations in his head about support structures and load-bearing requirements and all the technical considerations that determined whether bridges stood or collapsed into rivers, while everyone watched in horror. Here's what I recommend, Vel said finally. All wood construction. Not stone. Stone is permanent but requires engineering expertise you don't have yet. Wood is flexible, easier to work with, can be replaced if sections fail. Build on pilings driven deep into the riverbed, multiple supports to distribute weight, roadway high enough that normal flooding doesn't wash it away. How long would it take? Ancus asked. 2 years, Vel estimated. Maybe 3 if you encounter problems. Which you will. Everyone encounters problems with first bridges. The question is whether the problems are fixable or catastrophic. And cost. Vel named a figure that made Ancus wince slightly, but also understand that infrastructure was expensive and complaining about it wouldn't make it cheaper. We'll do it, Ancus decided. Start planning immediately. I want this bridge built within 3 years. Rome's expansion requires infrastructure, and I'd prefer to build it competently rather than quickly and poorly. Wise, Vel said. Though traditionally kings prefer quickly and impressively over competently and functional. I'm not traditional, Ancus replied. I'm my grandfather's grandson. We prefer things that actually work over things that look impressive but collapse. The bridge construction began in the spring of Ancus's 5th year as king. It was immediately more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The first challenge was religious. Building a bridge across the Tiber meant spanning sacred water, interfering with the river god's domain, potentially offending divine powers who might have opinions about humans building permanent structures through their territory. The priests insisted on elaborate ceremonies before construction could begin. Sacrifices to the river god, prayers requesting permission, formal declarations that Rome meant no disrespect and would maintain appropriate reverence for sacred water, even while building infrastructure across it. We're asking the river god's permission to bridge his river, Ancus explained to the gathered priests and engineers. Do we think he'll grant it? The river god doesn't typically respond to requests, Numa Pompilius said, so we'll interpret lack of immediate catastrophe as approval. Traditionally, that's how divine permission works. The gods express displeasure actively and approval through silence. That seems like a system designed to make humans assume the gods approve of whatever we want to do, one engineer pointed out. Yes, Numa Pompilius agreed, but it's the system we have, so we work with it. Perform the ceremonies properly, and if the river doesn't flood and destroy everything immediately, we'll assume permission was granted. The ceremonies were performed with appropriate gravity. Multiple sacrifices, extensive prayers, formal promises that the bridge would be maintained with reverence for the sacred water it crossed. The river continued flowing normally, which everyone agreed meant the river god was either approving or was waiting to express his opinion later in more dramatic fashion. Construction began. Driving pilings into the Tiber's bed was harder than the engineers expected. The riverbed was soft in some places, rocky in others, inconsistent in ways that made predicting where supports would hold difficult. Several pilings sank too deep. Others didn't sink deep enough. One section of riverbed collapsed entirely when they tried to drive supports, creating a hole that filled with water and made that area unusable. This is normal, Vel Larth assured Ancus during one of the regular progress reviews. First bridges always have complications. We're learning what this river specifically requires. Next bridge will be easier. I'm not planning to build multiple bridges, Ancus said. You will if this one works, Vel Larth replied. Successful infrastructure inspires more infrastructure. If the bridge functions, you'll want bridges everywhere. It's how engineering develops. The workers, a mix of Roman labourers, skilled Etruscan craftsmen, and some Politorian refugees who'd claimed construction experience, developed systems through trial and error, learned which techniques worked in this specific river, adjusted their approach when something failed, the kind of practical problem-solving that couldn't be planned in advance but only discovered through doing. 6 months into construction, a major flood nearly destroyed everything. Spring flooding was expected. They'd planned for it, built temporary protections, thought they'd prepared adequately. But this flood was larger than normal, rising faster than predicted, submerging the partial bridge structure with force that tested every support. The workers evacuated to shore and watched nervously as the river surged around and over their work. If the supports failed now, they'd lose 6 months of effort and have to start over. The supports held, barely, some bent, a few cracked. But the main structure survived the flood and emerged still standing when the water receded. The river god is testing us, Numa Marcius observed, inspecting the damage afterward. Or the river is just a river doing what rivers do, Vel Larth suggested. Sometimes water rises, sometimes it falls. Bridges need to survive both. This one did. That's progress. They repaired the damaged sections and continued building. More carefully now, with better understanding of what the Tiber could do when it decided to be difficult. Year 2 of construction brought different problems. The wooden pilings were holding, but the roadway was complicated. It needed to be level despite the uneven riverbed, needed to be strong enough for carts and cattle and soldiers in formation, needed to be wide enough for two-way traffic, but not so wide it required additional supports they couldn't afford. The engineers argued constantly about the best approach: build wider and stronger, or narrower and more economical, prioritize capacity or cost. Every decision involved trade-offs, and everyone had opinions about which trade-offs were acceptable. Ancus visited the construction site regularly, less to make technical decisions. He wisely left those to people who understood engineering, and more to maintain political and religious support for a project that was taking longer and costing more than initially planned. How much longer? Senators would ask during regular budget reviews. Until it's done properly, Ancus would reply. We're building something that needs to last decades, not just look impressive for my reign. That requires time and patience, and accepting that good infrastructure is expensive. Tullus built faster. Someone would inevitably point out, Tullus built walls and conquered cities. Ancus would reply, he didn't build bridges. Different kind of project, different timeline. Also, he died in flames, which suggests rushing things doesn't always produce optimal outcomes. The bridge conversation always ended with someone mentioning lightning, as if Rome's recent history required constant reminders that divine patience had limits. By the end of year 2, the bridge was perhaps 2/3 complete. The main structure stood. The roadway was taking shape. It was starting to look less like an expensive mistake, and more like functional infrastructure. I think it's actually going to work, Ancus said to Numa Marcius during one site visit. Don't say that out loud, the old priest warned. Premature confidence offends the gods. Wait until it's completely finished and has survived at least one flood season before declaring success. I said I think it will work. Not that I'm certain, Ancus clarified. That's not confidence, that's cautious optimism. Even cautious optimism can be dangerous, Numa Marcius said. The gods appreciate humility. Maintain humility until success is undeniable. I'm maintaining so much humility, Ancus assured him. I'm practically drowning in humility. The gods have nothing to complain about regarding my humility levels. That sounded suspiciously like confidence about your humility, Numa Marcius observed. Can we just build the bridge without worrying about whether my attitude toward the bridge offends the gods? Ancus asked. We can, Numa Marcius agreed. But given recent Roman history with divine displeasure, I recommend maintaining appropriate caution about everything, including your confidence levels about infrastructure projects. They walked back toward Rome, leaving the construction crews to continue their work. The bridge stood in the Tiber, connecting banks that had been separate for all of Rome's history, making the river less of a barrier and more of a feature that could be worked with rather than around. It was going to work. Probably, assuming the gods approved and the flooding didn't get worse, and the structure held, and none of the dozens of things that could go wrong went catastrophically wrong. Cautious optimism. That was the appropriate attitude. Definitely not confidence. Just cautious, humble, God-fearing optimism about functional infrastructure. The bridge was completed in the spring of Ancus's 7th year as king. 2.5 years of construction. Longer than planned, more expensive than estimated, more complicated than anyone had expected, but finished. Standing. Functional. Functional. The Pons Sublicius, they called it. The Bridge of Pilings. Simple name for simple construction. Wooden roadway on wooden supports, nothing fancy, purely functional. The dedication ceremony involved more religious observance than construction observation. Sacrifices to the river god, thanking him for permission, or at least for not destroying the bridge during construction. Prayers to Jupiter requesting the structure's preservation. Blessings from every available priest, because when you built Rome's first bridge, you took religious propriety seriously. Let this bridge stand as symbol of Rome's growth. Ancus announced during the ceremony, standing at the bridge's center with water flowing beneath him in ways that still felt slightly unnatural, of our ability to connect what was separate, to build infrastructure that serves practical purpose rather than just impressive appearance. This bridge will facilitate trade, enable military movement, connect Rome to territories and opportunities that were previously difficult to access. He paused, looking at the assembled crowd. Roman citizens, Politorian refugees, even some Etruscans who'd helped with construction. My grandfather built temples, Ancus continued. Tullus built territories. I'm building connections. Infrastructure that lets Rome function as the size it's become. This bridge is the first of many projects that will make Rome not just large but actually sustainable at scale. The crowd cheered, not the wild enthusiasm of military victory, but the satisfied approval of people who recognized useful infrastructure when they saw it. The bridge was open to traffic immediately. The first crossing was a ceremonial procession. Priests, senators, prominent citizens walking across in formal parade. Then regular traffic, merchants with goods, farmers with cattle, soldiers on patrol, ordinary people discovering they could cross the Tiber without boats for the first time in history. It's working, Vellath said, watching the traffic flow. Actually working. I'm pleasantly surprised. You thought it would fail? Ancus asked. I thought it might fail. Vellath clarified. First bridges often do, but this one appears to be functional. The supports are holding. The roadway is handling traffic adequately. The river hasn't expressed obvious displeasure through flooding or structural collapse. By every measure that matters, this is successful infrastructure. Will it last? Define last, Vellath said. Forever? No. Decades? Probably. It will require maintenance. Wood deteriorates, supports need replacing. Floods will cause damage that needs repair. But the basic structure is sound. Rome now has permanent river crossing. That's significant achievement. Ancus watched carts roll across the bridge and thought about what this meant. Rome could now trade more easily with Etruscan cities, could move military forces without relying on boats, could expand westward toward the coast with actual infrastructure supporting that expansion. The bridge was just wooden pilings, but it was also possibility, connection. The kind of practical foundation that civilizations were built on when they moved beyond pure military conquest into actual sustainable governance. This is balance, Ancus said quietly. Not just fighting or just praying, but building, creating infrastructure that serves practical purpose, making Rome function rather than just making Rome larger. Your grandfather would approve, Vellath said. He understood that cities require more than religious devotion. This bridge is Numa's wisdom applied to practical necessity. The traffic continued flowing. Rome continued growing. The bridge stood solid, connecting what had been separate, making possible what had been difficult. And Ancus felt, for perhaps the first time since becoming king, that he was actually accomplishing something meaningful. Not just administering what his predecessors built, not just maintaining balance, but actually adding something new, something useful, something that would outlast his reign and serve Rome for generations. Infrastructure. The unsexy, unglamorous work of civilization. It was working. The bridge opened possibilities that Rome hadn't fully considered when planning it. Trading with Etruscan cities became easier. Goods could move overland without the constant negotiation of boat transport, or the risk of cargo getting soaked or lost to river currents. Merchants who'd avoided Rome because of the crossing difficulty suddenly found the city accessible, and started appearing with Etruscan pottery, bronze work, and luxury goods that made Rome feel less provincial. But the most significant opportunity wasn't north toward Etruria. It was west, toward the coast, toward the Tiber's mouth where the river met the sea. "We need a port," Ancus announced to the Senate in his 8th year as king. The Senate had developed a particular response to Ancus's infrastructure proposals. Resigned acceptance combined with concern about cost and genuine curiosity about whether this one would also take longer than planned and require more resources than estimated. "A port," one senator repeated. "Where specifically?" "At Ostia," Ancus said, "where the Tiber meets the sea, about 15 miles downstream from Rome. Perfect location, accessible by river from Rome, accessible by sea from everywhere else. We establish a port city there. We control salt production from the coastal marshes, and we give Rome direct access to maritime trade." "We're not a maritime people," someone pointed out. "We're inland. We know land. We know rivers. We don't know boats or seas or whatever complications come with coastal settlement." "Then we'll learn," Ancus replied with the same stubborn optimism he'd applied to bridge building. "Other cities have ports. We figure out what they did and do the same thing, possibly with improvements because we're doing it later and can learn from their mistakes." "This will be expensive," another senator warned. "Everything is expensive," Ancus said. "Temples are expensive. Wars are expensive. Bridges are definitely expensive, as we recently discovered. Infrastructure costs resources. The question is whether the investment produces returns that justify the cost. And you think a port will?" "I think controlling salt production alone justifies the cost," Ancus said. "Salt is valuable. Everyone needs it for food preservation. The coastal marshes near Ostia produce quality salt. Currently, whoever happens to be nearby controls that production. I'd prefer Rome to control it, collect taxes on it, and benefit from one of the region's most reliable trade commodities." The Senate debated. Some senators saw the strategic value immediately. Controlling the Tiber's mouth meant controlling river access to Rome, which was defensive advantage as much as commercial opportunity. Others worried about overextension, about Rome trying to be too many things simultaneously, about resources being diverted from military campaigns or religious obligations or other priorities. "We're already maintaining territories we've conquered," one senator argued. "Adding a coastal settlement means another population to govern, another location to defend, another complication in an already complicated city-state." "We're not adding territory," Ancus countered. "We're adding infrastructure. Ostia serves Rome the way the bridge serves Rome, by making what we already have work better. The settlement will be small, focused on port operations and salt production, an extension of Rome rather than a separate city. Who will settle there?" someone asked practically. "We can't force Romans to move to the coast." "We don't force anyone," Ancus said. "We offer opportunity. Land for families who want it. Commercial opportunities for merchants. Employment in salt production and port operations. People will volunteer if the opportunity is attractive enough." It was the same approach he'd used with Politorium, offering choice rather than compulsion, making Rome attractive enough that people wanted to participate rather than requiring force. The Senate authorized the Ostia project with less debate than the bridge had required, partly because they trusted Ancus's infrastructure judgment more now that the bridge was functioning, partly because controlling salt production was obviously valuable, mostly because arguing with a king who'd spent 7 years successfully balancing opposing priorities was exhausting and Ancus had earned benefit of the doubt. Ancus left the Senate meeting and thought, "I'm about to found Rome's first colony. This should be interesting." The site selection for Ostia took several months of surveying. The Tiber's mouth was swampy, subject to flooding, full of mosquitoes and the particular challenges that came with building on coastal wetlands. But it was also exactly where they needed to be, at the intersection of river and sea, where Roman river traffic could meet Mediterranean maritime trade. The engineers, led again by Vel Larth, who'd apparently been permanently assigned to Rome's infrastructure projects, assessed the terrain and made recommendations. "Build on slightly elevated ground," Vel Larth advised. "Not right at the waterline where flooding is constant. Close enough to access the water easily, far enough that daily life isn't dictated by tides. Drainage is crucial. The ground is wet. You'll need systems to channel water away from inhabited areas. How large should we make it? Ancus asked. Start small, Vel recommended. A few dozen families, port facilities, salt production infrastructure, basic defensive walls. Let it grow organically as demand increases, rather than building massive settlement that stays half empty, because you overestimated need. That seems wise, Ancus agreed. Though I feel like we're learning infrastructure development through trial and error, and probably making mistakes we'll regret later. Everyone makes mistakes with first colonies, Vel assured him. The question is whether the mistakes are catastrophic or just inconvenient. Aim for inconvenient. The settlement design was practical rather than impressive. Grid layout for easy organization, central market area, port facilities along the river, salt evaporation ponds in the marshes, defensive walls. Not elaborate, just sufficient to discourage casual raiding, housing plots marked for settlement, temple space reserved for religious obligations. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatic, just functional infrastructure for a working port settlement. This is very unlike how Romulus founded Rome, one senator observed, looking at the plans. He had divine visions and signs from gods and dramatic moments of destiny. You have grid layouts and drainage systems. Romulus was founding a capital city, Ancus replied. I'm founding a port. Different purpose, different approach. His method worked for what he needed. This method will work for what we need. Both are valid. Less dramatic, though, the senator pointed out. Infrastructure is rarely dramatic, Ancus agreed. But it's often more useful than drama. Recruiting settlers for Ostia was easier than Ancus expected. He announced the opportunity publicly. Free land for any Roman citizen willing to relocate to the coast. Employment in salt production or port operations. Chance to be part of founding a new settlement. The kind of offer that appealed to younger sons who wouldn't inherit family property, to merchants looking for commercial opportunities, to anyone who felt constrained by Rome's growing population and wanted space to build something new. Within 3 months, they had volunteers. Not hundreds, but enough, perhaps 50 families who saw opportunity in coastal settlement and were willing to accept the challenges that came with it. Why do you want to go? Ancus asked one volunteer. A young farmer named Gaius who was perhaps 20 and clearly excited about the prospect. Rome is crowded, Gaius explained. My father's farm will go to my older brother. I could stay and work for him, or I could have my own land in Ostia. Easy choice. Ostia is swampy, Ancus warned. Lots of mosquitoes, flooding, unknown challenges because we've never settled there before. Rome was probably difficult when Romulus founded it, Gaius replied. Every settlement starts with challenges. At least at Ostia I'll own property instead of just working someone else's. It was practical reasoning that Ancus appreciated. People motivated by actual opportunity rather than just romantic notions of adventure. The kind of settlers who'd work hard because they had personal investment in success. The migration to Ostia happened in early spring. Best time for construction, before summer heat made working in marshes miserable. The settlers travelled by boat down the Tiber, carrying tools and supplies and whatever personal possessions they decided to bring to their new home. Ancus accompanied them for the initial settlement, wanting to see the founding personally, to understand what coastal settlement required, to make sure the project started properly, even if he couldn't stay to oversee every detail. The Ostian site was unpromising, swampy, as warned, thick with vegetation. The river here was wide and sluggish, less dramatic than at Rome, but also less useful for immediate purposes. The sea was visible in the distance, grey and vast and full of possibilities and probably also full of dangers that inland Romans didn't understand. This is where we're settling, one volunteer asked, surveying the marshy landscape with visible doubt. This is where we're settling, Ancus confirmed. It looks unpromising now. It will look better after we've built drainage, cleared land, and established actual infrastructure. Every city looks unpromising at the very beginning. You're seeing potential, not reality. I'm seeing swamp, the settler said. Swamp with potential, Ancus corrected. Swamp that will become Rome's port, Rome's salt production centre, Rome's connection to maritime trade. Significant swamp, destiny-laden swamp. The settler didn't look convinced, but also didn't turn back, which was the important part. The Ostia settlement was established with appropriate religious ceremony, because if Rome had learned anything from the lightning incident, it was that new foundations required divine approval, or at least the appearance of seeking divine approval. The augurs performed bird observations. The birds flew in patterns that could be interpreted as either definitely auspicious or probably auspicious, depending on how optimistic you were feeling. The augurs decided to go with definitely auspicious, because discouraging a group of settlers who were already looking at swamp with doubt seemed counterproductive. Sacrifices were performed to Neptune, because this was coastal, and Neptune had jurisdiction, and to the Tiber's river god, because the settlement was technically at the river's mouth, and not offending river gods remained a priority. Also sacrifices to the local spirits of place, whoever they were, requesting cooperation with Roman settlement. We've sacrificed to approximately 15 different divine entities, one settler observed. Are we sure we haven't missed any? I'm never sure, Ancus admitted. The divine bureaucracy is complicated, and we probably don't know about all the gods who have jurisdiction over coastal marshes. But we've made good faith effort to honor everyone we know about. Hopefully that's sufficient, and if it's not, then we'll discover which god we offended when something goes wrong, and we'll apologize profusely and make additional sacrifices. Ancus said, "That's how divine relations work. You try your best and correct mistakes as you discover them." The foundation ceremony concluded without obvious divine disapproval, which everyone agreed meant they could proceed with actual construction. The initial months were challenging. Drainage systems needed to be dug through wet ground. Housing plots needed to be cleared of vegetation. The port facilities required pilings driven into muddy riverbanks. Salt evaporation ponds needed to be designed and constructed in the marshes. Everything took longer in wet conditions. Everything was complicated by mosquitoes. Everyone discovered new reasons why coastal settlement was different from inland settlement, and required different solutions, but progress happened. Slowly, imperfectly, with numerous adjustments as they discovered what worked in this specific location. The kind of practical problem-solving that couldn't be planned in advance but only learned through direct experience. Ancus visited regularly during the first year, checking progress, resolving disputes, making sure the settlers had resources they needed. It was hands-on governance, the kind that required actual presence rather than just sending orders from Rome and hoping they were followed. This is very different from conquering cities, Marcus Valerius observed during one visit. The old Fetialis had accompanied Ancus because someone needed to maintain religious observance and make sure the gods remained satisfied with Ostia's development. Very different, Ancus agreed. Conquest is dramatic. You fight, you win, it's over. Settlement is gradual. You build, you adjust, you keep building. Less immediately satisfying, but probably more useful long-term. Your grandfather would approve, Marcus Valerius said. He understood that Rome needed more than just military victories. That lasting strength came from infrastructure and organization, not just battlefield success. They stood on a small rise overlooking the developing settlement. A few dozen houses were taking shape. The port facilities were under construction. The salt ponds were being prepared for summer production. It was small, rough, clearly incomplete, but it was also functional, growing, becoming something. This is what balance looks like, Ancus said quietly. Not just fighting or just praying. Building, creating things that serve practical purpose and last beyond any individual reign. The salt production began in Ostia's first summer. The process was simple in concept, complicated in execution. Flood shallow ponds with seawater, let the sun evaporate it, collect the salt that remained, repeat continuously throughout summer, when evaporation rates were highest. The Ostian settlers learned through trial and error. Some ponds worked better than others, some salt was higher quality, some techniques produced more yield than others, the kind of practical knowledge that developed through experience rather than planning. By autumn, they had produced several tons of salt. Not an enormous amount by regional standards, but enough to prove the concept worked, enough to start generating revenue, enough to justify the settlement's existence beyond just Rome wanted a port and hoped it would work. The salt was transported to Rome by boat. Ironic that Rome's bridge facilitated land travel, but salt came by water and sold in Roman markets. Premium pricing because it was Roman salt from Roman-controlled production, not just whatever salt traders happened to bring. This is working, Ancus said to Numa Marcius during one of his regular briefings on Rome's various projects. Ostia is producing salt. The port facilities are attracting some trading traffic. The settlement is growing. It's not dramatic success, but it's functional success, which is better. Functional success is underrated. Numa Marcius agreed. People remember dramatic victories and tragic failures. They forget the steady, competent governance that actually keeps cities running. But the steady competence is what matters for long-term survival. So I won't be remembered as dramatically as Romulus or Tullus? Ancus asked with mild amusement. You'll be remembered as the king who built things, Numa Marcius said. Which is less exciting than the king who was raised by wolves, or the king who was killed by lightning, but probably more useful as a model for future governance. Ancus thought about that, about legacy and memory, and how history would remember him. The practical king, the bridge builder, the one who did unglamorous work that made Rome function. It wasn't the legacy he'd imagined when accepting the crown, but it was, he was discovering, the legacy he was actually building, and maybe that was fine. Maybe Rome needed someone who built bridges and ports more than it needed another dramatic hero or tragic victim. The salt trade continued. The port traffic increased gradually, as word spread that Ostia was accessible and Roman-controlled. The settlement grew from 50 families to perhaps 70, then to 100 as more Romans saw opportunity in coastal life. It was working. Slowly. Imperfectly. But working. Infrastructure. Commerce. The practical foundations of civilization. Less dramatic than conquest. More sustainable than temples alone. Balance. Finally, after 8 years of trying, by his 10th year as king, Ancus had transformed Rome's relationship with the coast. The bridge connected Rome to western territories. Ostia provided port access and salt production. Trade routes that had been difficult became routine. Roman merchants reached Etruscan cities, Greek colonies in southern Italy, even Carthaginian traders who came up the Italian coast. Rome was no longer just an inland city-state. It was becoming a commercial power. Not through conquest alone, but through infrastructure that facilitated trade, that made Rome the natural center for regional commerce, that created wealth through exchange rather than just plunder. This is different from how Rome grew under Tullus. One senator observed during a discussion of trade revenues. He expanded through conquest. You're expanding through, what? Building things. Through making Rome useful, Ancus replied. Tullus made Rome feared. That works for military dominance. But fear alone doesn't create sustainable prosperity. If you want lasting strength, you need to make your city the place where trade flows naturally, where infrastructure supports commerce, where people want to do business because it's easier and more profitable than alternatives. That sounds less exciting than conquest, the senator said. It is less exciting than conquest, Ancus agreed. It's also more boring than mystical consultations with goddesses. But it's what Rome actually needs at this size. We're too large now to survive on military conquest alone. We need economic foundation, trade revenues, salt production, port facilities, the unglamorous infrastructure that keeps cities functional. The Senate authorized continued investment in Ostia's development, expansion of port facilities, additional salt production capacity, better roads connecting Rome to the coast. The kind of incremental infrastructure improvement that was never dramatic, but collectively made significant difference. Ancus watched Rome become more complex, more diversified, less dependent on any single source of strength. Not just a military power like under Tullus, not just a religious center like under Numa, but a functional civilization with multiple sources of resilience. Military when needed, spiritual when appropriate, commercial as constant foundation. This is what you were trying to build, Numa Marcius said during one of their regular conversations. The old priest was perhaps 85 now, remarkably still alive, still serving as Pontifex Maximus, still providing continuity from Numa's time through Tullus's aggression to Ancus's pragmatic synthesis. Rome that works, Rome that doesn't depend on having perfect kings with specific talents, Rome that can sustain itself through institutional strength rather than individual genius. Is that success? Ancus asked. That's exactly success, Numa Marcius replied. You won't be remembered as dramatically as your predecessors. You're too competent to be tragic, too practical to be mystical. But you've built something more important than either Romulus's legend or Tullus's territories. You've built Rome's capacity to actually function at scale. That's the unglamorous work of civilization, and it's what Rome needed most. Ancus stood on the Capitoline Hill and looked out at the city, larger than when he'd become king, more diverse, more connected to the wider world through bridges and ports and trade routes. Not the Rome that Numa had left or that Tullus had expanded. Something different, something more sustainable. Balance, infrastructure, the practical work of making dreams functional. It was working. Finally, after 10 years of trying, the bridge stood, the port functioned, the salt flowed, Rome traded and grew, and became something more than just military camp or religious commune. It became a civilization. Slowly, unglamorously, through the patient accumulation of infrastructure that nobody would write epic poems about, but everyone would depend on. Ancus Marcius, the bridge builder, the practical king, the one who made Rome work. Not a bad legacy, he thought. Not dramatic, but real, and reality, he'd discovered, mattered more than drama for long-term survival. By his 15th year as king, Ancus had settled into a pattern of governance that was simultaneously successful and unsatisfying. Successful because Rome was thriving. The territories conquered from Politorium and other small Latin cities were integrated and productive. The bridge facilitated trade and military movement. Ostia generated steady revenue from salt production and port fees. The population had grown without major unrest. The gods appeared satisfied. No lightning strikes, no plagues, no obvious divine displeasure. Unsatisfying. Because Ancus was discovering that being competent at governance didn't actually make anyone enthusiastic about your reign. The military veterans missed Tullus's constant campaigns. "We used to do things," one old soldier complained in a tavern conversation that was reported back to Ancus by people who thought the king should know about public sentiment. "We fought. We conquered. We felt like Rome was moving forward. Now we just maintain things, build bridges, manage ports. It's very administrative." Administrative had apparently become an insult when used to describe military policy. The priests appreciated the restored religious observances, but quietly missed Numa's mystical consultations and spiritual depth. "Ancus is dutiful," Numa Marcius reported diplomatically. "He performs ceremonies correctly. But your grandfather had connection, real relationship with the divine. Ancus has religious propriety without religious passion. So the warriors thought he was too priestly. The priests thought he wasn't priestly enough. The aggressive Romans wanted more conquest. The peaceful Romans wanted more temples. Everyone wanted him to be more like their preferred previous king, while also being completely different from the aspects of those kings they hadn't liked. "I'm not making anyone happy," Ancus said to his wife one evening. They were sitting in their modest house. He'd still refused to move to a palace, partly from principle and partly from lingering concerns about lightning, discussing the challenge of governing people with contradictory expectations. "You're making Rome functional," his wife replied practically. "Happy is different from functional. Functional matters more, does it?" Ancus asked. "If everyone is disappointed by their functional king, does the functionality actually count as success? Ask me in 20 years when your infrastructure is still standing and Rome is still thriving," his wife suggested. "Legacy isn't measured by whether people were excited during your reign. It's measured by what you left behind." She was probably right. But immediate disappointment still felt more real than potential long-term appreciation. The criticism became more pointed when Rome's neighbours started testing boundaries again. The Volscum, a people south of Latium who'd watched Rome's expansion with growing concern, began raiding Roman territory. Nothing major, just probing attacks testing whether Ancus was as militarily capable as Tullus, or whether his bridge building indicated weakness. The Senate debate about responding was predictable. "We should crush them," one faction argued. "Immediately, decisively, show them that Rome under Ancus is still Rome, that we haven't gone soft just because we're building infrastructure. We should try diplomatic solution," another faction countered. "Use the fetialas, offer terms, only fight if absolutely necessary. That's what Ancus's approach is supposed to be. War as last resort, not first option." "The fetiales take 33 days," the military faction objected. 33 days of sacred ceremony, while the Volscians raid our territory and laugh at us. Again, they're already laughing about the herbs. Do we want them laughing about the lengthy diplomatic process too? Ancus sat through the debate and felt the familiar frustration of trying to balance opposing priorities that everyone thought were obvious and mutually exclusive. Finally, he proposed a compromise that satisfied no one, but was probably optimal. "We respond militarily," Ancus announced, "but proportionally. They've raided our territory, we raid theirs. They've taken cattle, we take cattle. We match their aggression exactly, demonstrate that Rome can respond when challenged. But we don't escalate to full war unless they escalate first. That's weak," the military faction said immediately. "That's restrained," Ancus corrected. "There's a difference. Weak means not responding. Restrained means responding appropriately rather than overwhelming." The Volscians are testing us, we're showing them we notice and can respond, but we're not interested in starting major war over minor raids. What if they interpret restraint as weakness? Someone asked. Then we escalate proportionally, Ancus replied. If they increase their attacks, we increase ours. If they keep it small, we keep it small. If they want full war, we'll give them full war. But we let them choose the level of conflict, rather than immediately jumping to maximum aggression. The Senate approved the approach, mostly because arguing with Ancus's careful reasoning was exhausting, and he'd spent 15 years proving his judgment was usually sound, even when it was unsatisfying. The proportional response was implemented. Roman soldiers conducted counter-raids into Volscian territory, took cattle, burned some grain storage, made it clear that Rome could and would respond to aggression without starting unnecessary wars. The Volscians got the message. The raiding stopped. No dramatic conquest, no climactic battle, no satisfying military victory to celebrate, just effective deterrence through measured response. This is boring, one soldier complained after returning from the counter-raid. We went all the way to Volscian territory, took some cattle, came back. That's it. No glory, no triumph, just cattle theft as foreign policy. Cattle theft as foreign policy is working, his commander pointed out. The Volscians stopped raiding us. Mission accomplished. Not every military success requires dramatic combat. I preferred Tullus, the soldier grumbled. The phrase had become almost ritual. Whenever something seemed insufficiently dramatic, someone would mutter about preferring Tullus, apparently forgetting that Tullus had ended his reign as a charred corpse in a burning palace. The middle years of Ancus's reign settled into routine that was effective but rarely exciting. Infrastructure projects continued. Roads were improved between Rome and its territories. The bridge required maintenance, wood deteriorated, supports needed replacing, floods caused damage that had to be repaired. Ostia expanded gradually, adding housing and port facilities as trade increased. Wars happened occasionally, but they were managed wars. Proportional responses to provocations, strategic campaigns when necessary to secure boundaries or protect trade routes. Never the constant military expansion that had characterized Tullus's reign, but not the complete peace that had defined Numa's either. Religious observances continued properly. Festivals happened on schedule. Priesthoods functioned. The gods appeared satisfied or at least not actively displeased. Ancus visited the grove beneath the Aventine Hill regularly, not expecting mystical visions but maintaining the practice because it seemed important to demonstrate continuous divine attention. Still no voices from the spring? Numa Pompilius asked during one of these visits. Still no voices, Ancus confirmed. Just water and trees and the awareness that I'm not my grandfather and probably never will be. That's fine, Numa Marcius said. Rome doesn't need another Numa. It needs someone who learnt from Numa without being trapped by his example. You're doing that successfully, even if it doesn't feel dramatic. Success without drama, Ancus mused. Is that even real success or just adequate administration? In governance, adequate administration is success, Numa Marcius replied. The dramatic kings are remembered more vividly, but they're not necessarily better. Romulus gave us legendary founding but also constant violence. Numa gave us spiritual foundation but also vulnerability. Tullus gave us expansion but also lightning. You're giving us sustainability. That's not exciting, but it's what Rome needs to survive long term. The old priest was probably right. But probably right didn't make the middle path feel less lonely when everyone wanted you to be more extreme in one direction or another. The loneliness of moderation became more apparent as Ancus aged. He was approaching 60 now. Not ancient by any means, but old enough to feel mortality approaching, to think about legacy, to wonder whether his reign would be remembered at all, or just treated as the boring interlude between more interesting kings. His children were grown. His wife remained supportive but realistic about the challenges of governing a city that wanted contradictory things. His friends, the few he'd maintained despite the isolating nature of kingship, offered sympathy but couldn't really understand the particular burden of trying to please everyone while satisfying no one completely. You look tired, his wife observed one evening. I am tired, Ancus admitted. Not physically, I'm healthy enough, but tired of the constant calculation, the endless balancing, the awareness that every decision I make disappoints someone. The military types want more aggression, the peaceful types want more restraint, the religious want more devotion, the practical want more infrastructure, and I'm just here trying to do enough of everything that Rome doesn't collapse while knowing that enough of everything makes me adequately forgettable. You're not forgettable, his wife said. You built the bridge. You founded Ostia. You integrated conquered peoples successfully. You kept Rome stable for 20 years. That's significant. That's administrative. Ancus corrected with tired humour. Apparently that's the worst thing you can be. Administrative civilizations last longer than dramatic ones, his wife pointed out. Ask me which I prefer. She had a point. But legacy and living through your reign were different things. And living through constant moderate disapproval was exhausting in ways that dramatic success or dramatic failure probably weren't. The challenge of the middle path became philosophical in Ancus's later years. He'd spent 2 decades trying to balance opposing forces, military and spiritual, conquest and diplomacy, expansion and consolidation, and he'd succeeded, mostly. Rome was stable, functional, growing sustainably. The gods were honoured, the borders were secure, the infrastructure worked. But balance, Ancus was discovering, wasn't a destination you reached. It was continuous effort, constant recalibration, endless awareness that you couldn't stop managing the tensions just because you'd managed them successfully so far. Is there a point where it becomes easier? Ancus asked Numa Marcius during one of their regular conversations. The old priest was 90 now, impossibly ancient, still serving as Pontifex Maximus through sheer stubbornness and possibly divine favour. No, Numa Marcius said bluntly. Balance requires continuous effort. The moment you stop actively maintaining it, forces pull toward extremes. That's human nature. We like clarity, simplicity, choosing one thing completely rather than multiple things partially. Moderation fights human instinct constantly. It never becomes easy. That's discouraging, Ancus said. That's honest, Numa Marcius replied. Your grandfather understood this. He spent 43 years maintaining balance between religious devotion and practical governance. Never stopped being work, never became automatic. He just accepted that the work was necessary and kept doing it. And I have to do the same, Ancus said. You have to do the same, Numa Marcius confirmed, until you die or abdicate or get struck by lightning. Hopefully just the first one, given recent Roman history. The lightning reference had become dark humour at this point. A reminder that even successful kings faced divine judgment eventually, that no amount of careful balance guaranteed avoiding catastrophe. But Ancus wasn't being struck by lightning, wasn't facing plague or military disaster, or obvious divine displeasure. He was just governing, adequately, sustainably, with the dull awareness that he'd spend the rest of his life managing tensions that would never fully resolve. This is what wisdom looks like, Numa Marcius said, watching Ancus process these thoughts. Not mystical enlightenment, not dramatic revelation, just the tired acceptance that complexity requires complex solutions and simple answers are usually wrong even though they're more satisfying. Wisdom is exhausting, Ancus observed. Wisdom is exhausting, Numa Marcius agreed, but it's better than the alternative, which is typically disaster. Rome, unaware of or indifferent to Ancus's philosophical exhaustion, continued functioning. The bridge carried traffic. The port processed goods. The salt production generated revenue. The conquered territories remained integrated. The military protected borders without constant expansion. The priests maintained ceremonies. The festivals happened on schedule. Everything worked. Not spectacularly, not dramatically, just worked. And that, Ancus realized in his 20th year as king, was actually the goal. Not to be remembered dramatically, not to have epic stories told about your reign, but to build systems that functioned independently of whoever was king, that would outlast any individual ruler, that made Rome sustainable rather than dependent on having extraordinary leaders. I've made myself unnecessary, Ancus said to his wife one evening, realizing this with mixed feelings. The systems work, the infrastructure functions. Rome could probably govern itself at this point without me making constant decisions. That's success, his wife said. You've built institutional strength. That's what civilization requires. Not dependence on individual genius, but systems that work with normal, competent people. So my achievement is making it possible for normal, competent people to govern Rome? Ancus asked. Yes, his wife confirmed. That's exactly your achievement. And it's more important than anything Romulus or Numa or Tullus accomplished, because what you built will last longer than any of their dramatic accomplishments. Ancus hoped she was right. Hoped that unsexy institutional strength mattered more than legendary heroism or mystical wisdom or military dominance. Hoped that making himself unnecessary was actually success rather than just elaborate self-sabotage, the middle path. Neither extreme nor simple. just continuous effort to maintain balance that required constant attention but produced reliable results. It was working. For 20 years it had been working, and maybe that was enough. Maybe being the king, nobody was excited about but everyone could depend on, was actually the highest form of governance. Maybe balance was its own reward, even if the reward felt like exhaustion. The bridge stood, the port functioned, Rome grew, adequate, administrative, sustainable, success, defined unglamorously. Ancus Marcius, the practical king, the one who built systems rather than legends, the one who made Rome work without making anyone particularly happy about it. Not the legacy he'd imagined, but the legacy Rome needed. The middle path, walked alone while everyone wished you'd chosen an extreme, but walked successfully anyway, because someone had to. And apparently, that someone was him. "This is very undramatic," Ancus observed to his wife during his final days. His voice was weak now, barely more than whisper, but his sense of humour remained intact. Romulus disappeared in a storm and became a god. Tullus died in flames. I'm just fading. Very administrative way to die. Ancus Marcius died in his bed at age 65, having ruled Rome for 24 years. There was no lightning, no mysterious disappearance, no dramatic final moments. He simply got sick, the kind of illness that older people sometimes got, that progressed over weeks, that gave him time to settle his affairs and say his goodbyes and make peace with the legacy he was leaving. "You would find a way to joke about administrative death," his wife said, holding his hand. "Even now, especially now," Ancus replied. "If I can't die dramatically, I can at least die with self-awareness about the lack of drama." The Senate came to visit, offering formal thanks for his service. The priests came to perform appropriate ceremonies and ensure his passage to the afterlife would be properly sanctioned. Even a few elderly soldiers who'd served under Tullus came, apparently feeling nostalgic for kings who'd at least tried to balance things rather than just conquering everything in sight. "You built good things," one old veteran said awkwardly, standing at Ancus's bedside with the uncomfortable posture of someone who wasn't good at emotional conversations. "The bridge, the port, made Rome work better, that matters." Tullus died screaming in a burning palace, the veteran pointed out. "Your way seems better, actually. Less exciting, but better. Thank you," Ancus said quietly. "I know my reign wasn't as exciting as Tullus's campaigns." Numa Marcius visited in the final days. The ancient priest was 92 now, impossibly old, moving slowly but still sharp-minded, and still insisting on performing his duties as Pontifex Maximus until actual death prevented it. It was perhaps the highest praise Ancus's pragmatic governance would receive. Less exciting but better. "You gave Rome what it needed rather than what it wanted," Numa Marcius replied. "There's a difference. What it wanted was drama, either Romulus's legendary heroism, or Numa's mystical wisdom, or Tullus's military dominance. What it needed was someone who understood that all three approaches were partially right and partially wrong, and that actual governance required combining them rather than choosing one exclusively." "Did I?" Ancus asked. "I spent 24 years making almost everyone moderately disappointed. The warriors wanted more conquest. The priests wanted more devotion. Everyone wanted me to be more like their preferred previous king. You did well," Numa Marcius said, sitting beside Ancus's bed with the careful movements of someone whose bones protested existence. "Your grandfather would be proud. Your legacy is sustainability," Numa Marcius corrected. "Romulus founded Rome but left it vulnerable to his absence. Numa gave it structure but left it vulnerable to aggression. Tullus made it powerful but left it vulnerable to divine displeasure. You made it sustainable, capable of surviving normal leadership rather than requiring extraordinary kings. That's actually the most important legacy of all, even if it's the least dramatic. So my legacy is combination," Ancus said. "That feels less significant than founding Rome or establishing its religious calendar or doubling its territory." Ancus thought about that, about infrastructure that lasted beyond any individual reign, about systems that functioned with adequate rather than extraordinary leadership, about the unglamorous work of making civilization actually work. "The bridge will last," he said quietly. "Ostia will keep producing salt. The integrated populations will keep becoming more Roman. The systems will function. That's what I built. Things that continue working after I'm gone." "That's very unsatisfying wisdom," Ancus observed. "Exactly," Numa Marcius said. "The other kings built things that depended on them. You built things that don't. That's wisdom. The final conversation was with his eldest son, who would not become king. Rome still chose its kings rather than inheriting them, but who would carry the family legacy forward. Most wisdom is unsatisfying. Numa Marcius agreed, but it's still wisdom. Ancus Marcius died in his bed at age 65, having ruled Rome for 24 years. There was no lightning, no mysterious disappearance, no dramatic final moments. He simply got sick, the kind of illness that older people sometimes got, that progressed over weeks, that gave him time to settle his affairs and say his goodbyes and make peace with the legacy he was leaving. "This is very undramatic," Ancus observed to his wife during his final days. His voice was weak now, barely more than whisper, but his sense of humour remained intact. Romulus disappeared in a storm and became a god. Tullus died in flames. I'm just fading. Very administrative way to die. You would find a way to joke about administrative death, his wife said, holding his hand. Even now. Especially now, Ancus replied. If I can't die dramatically, I can at least die with self-awareness about the lack of drama. The Senate came to visit, offering formal thanks for his service. The priests came to perform appropriate ceremonies and ensure his passage to the afterlife would be properly sanctioned. Even a few elderly soldiers who'd served under Tullus came, apparently feeling nostalgic for kings who'd at least tried to balance things rather than just conquering everything in sight. "You built good things," one old veteran said awkwardly, standing at Ancus's bedside with the uncomfortable posture of someone who wasn't good at emotional conversations. "The bridge, the port, made Rome work better, that matters. Thank you," Ancus said quietly. "I know my reign wasn't as exciting as Tullus's campaigns." Tullus died screaming in a burning palace, the veteran pointed out. "Your way seems better, actually. Less exciting, but better." It was perhaps the highest praise Ancus's pragmatic governance would receive. Less exciting, but better. Numa Marcius visited in the final days. The ancient priest was 92 now, impossibly old, moving slowly but still sharp-minded, and still insisting on performing his duties as Pontifex Maximus until actual death prevented it. "You did well," Numa Marcius said, sitting beside Ancus's bed with the careful movements of someone whose bones protested existence. "Your grandfather would be proud." "Did I?" Ancus asked. "I spent 24 years making almost everyone moderately disappointed. The warriors wanted more conquest. The priests wanted more devotion. Everyone wanted me to be more like their preferred previous king. You gave Rome what it needed rather than what it wanted," Numa Marcius replied. "There's a difference. What it wanted was drama, either Romulus's legendary heroism, or Numa's mystical wisdom, or Tullus's military dominance. What it needed was someone who understood that all three approaches were partially right and partially wrong, and that actual governance required combining them rather than choosing one exclusively. So my legacy is combination," Ancus said. "That feels less significant than founding Rome or establishing its religious calendar or doubling its territory. Your legacy is sustainability," Numa Marcius corrected. "Romulus founded Rome but left it vulnerable to his absence. Numa gave it structure but left it vulnerable to aggression. Tullus made it powerful but left it vulnerable to divine displeasure. You made it sustainable, capable of surviving normal leadership rather than requiring extraordinary kings. That's actually the most important legacy of all, even if it's the least dramatic." Ancus thought about that. About infrastructure that lasted beyond any individual reign. About systems that functioned with adequate rather than extraordinary leadership. About the unglamorous work of making civilization actually work. "The bridge will last," he said quietly. "Ostia will keep producing salt. The integrated populations will keep becoming more Roman. The systems will function. That's what I built. Things that continue working after I'm gone." "Exactly," Numa Marcius said. "The other kings built things that depended on them. You built things that don't. That's wisdom." "That's very unsatisfying wisdom," Ancus observed. "Most wisdom is unsatisfying," Numa Marcius agreed, "but it's still wisdom." The final conversation was with his eldest son, who would not become king. Rome still chose its kings rather than inheriting them, but who would carry the family legacy forward. "I'm not leaving you a legend," Ancus said. "Not like if you were Romulus's son or Numa's grandson. Wait, you are Numa's great-grandson. That's confusing. Anyway, I'm not leaving you dramatic stories to live up to or legendary achievements to match. I'm leaving you the example of adequate governance. Make of that what you will." "I think adequate governance is underrated," his son replied. "Better than the alternatives I've observed." Your children will think I was boring, Ancus said. Your grandchildren will barely remember me. In a few generations I'll be a footnote. Ancus Marcius, he built a bridge, ruled competently, died normally. That's the legacy. That's not a bad legacy, his son said. The bridge still stands. Ostia still functions. Rome still works because of systems you established. That matters more than being remembered dramatically. Does it? Ancus asked. Or do we just tell ourselves that because dramatic remembrance isn't available? Ask the bridge, his son suggested. In 50 years, when it's still carrying traffic and people have forgotten who built it. Ask if that's meaningful legacy. Ancus smiled slightly. His son had inherited his practicality, his understanding that function mattered more than fame. That was something at least. You'll do well, Ancus said. You understand what matters. That's all I can really leave you understanding. That unsexy competence beats dramatic failure. That sustainability matters more than spectacle. That building things that work is harder and more important than building things that impress. I'll remember, his son promised. Good, Ancus said, because I probably won't be remembered much beyond that king who built infrastructure. Someone should remember the actual lessons. Ancus died on a quiet afternoon in late summer, surrounded by family, having made peace with his legacy, or at least with his inability to make it more dramatic than it was. The funeral was appropriate, but not excessive. No claims that he'd become a god, that seemed to be Romulus's exclusive privilege. No massive public mourning. He wasn't Numa. Didn't inspire that kind of spiritual devotion. Just respectful recognition of a king who'd served competently for nearly a quarter century without catastrophic failure or legendary achievement. He built the bridge. The funeral oration said. He founded Ostia. He integrated conquered peoples successfully. He maintained balance between military strength and religious devotion. He made Rome work. That is sufficient legacy. The crowd agreed. In the quiet way crowds agreed with statements that were obviously true but not particularly exciting. Ancus was buried without incident. No lightning struck during the funeral. No mysterious storms. No signs from gods suggesting either approval or disapproval. Just normal burial for a normal king who'd governed normally successfully. The Senate met immediately after the funeral to choose Rome's fifth king. The debate was familiar. What did Rome need next? Another moderate king like Ancus? Or someone more dramatic, more decisive, more willing to choose direction rather than continuously balancing opposing forces? They chose someone from outside Rome entirely. A wealthy Etruscan merchant named Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, who'd been living in Rome for years, who understood both Etruscan culture and Roman values, who represented expansion of a different kind than Ancus's infrastructure projects. But that's a story for another time. For now, Rome mourned its fourth king and tried to understand what he'd accomplished. The weeks after Ancus's death brought unexpected recognition. The bridge required maintenance. A support had cracked during recent floods. The workers who went to repair it realized how cleverly the original design had been, how thoughtfully the supports had been placed, how the whole structure had been built to survive exactly the kind of damage it was currently experiencing. Ancus built this well, one worker said, examining the cracked support. Could have taken shortcuts, could have made it cheaper, but he built it to last. Built it so we could repair it rather than rebuild it. The realization spread. Ancus's infrastructure wasn't just functional, it was maintainable, designed with the understanding that things would need repair, that future workers would need to fix damage, that sustainability meant building for maintenance rather than just initial construction. Ostia's port was handling increased trade traffic. The salt production had expanded beyond initial capacity. The settlement that had started as perhaps 50 families had grown to several hundred, was becoming a real town rather than just a Roman outpost. This is working better than we expected, the Ostian administrator reported to the Senate. Ancus designed it to grow, left room for expansion, made the initial layout flexible enough to adapt. He was thinking decades ahead. The integrated populations from Politorium and other conquered cities were barely distinguishable from original Romans now. Their children had married Roman children. Their gods shared temple space. Their families had become Roman families without the resentment and resistance that had characterized Alba Longa's forced integration. Ancus gave us choice. One Politorian settler said during a conversation about the late king, that made all the difference. We chose to become Roman. That made us want it to work rather than waiting for it to fail. Slowly, gradually, Rome began to understand what it had lost. Mome, not a legendary hero, not a mystical sage, not a military genius, but a king who'd built things that worked, who'd thought about the future, who'd made decisions based on sustainability rather than immediate impact, who'd valued function over flash, the kind of king nobody appreciated during his reign because his successes were too subtle, too long-term, too boring to celebrate, but the kind of king civilizations actually needed to survive. 10 years after Ancus's death, the bridge still stood. It had required repairs, supports replaced, roadway sections rebuilt, constant maintenance to keep it functional. But the basic structure remained sound. The design was still good. The bridge still carried traffic, still connected Rome to territories beyond the Tiber, still made possible the expansion that had followed its construction. Travelers crossing it rarely thought about who'd built it. It was just there, part of the landscape, assumed infrastructure that people used without considering. But some people remembered. Ancus Marcius built this. An old man told his grandson while crossing the bridge one afternoon. Back when I was young, took years to build. Everyone thought it might fail, but it's still here. What was he like? The grandson asked. Ancus Marcius. Was he a great king? The old man considered. He was a good king. Not great like Romulus. Not wise like Numa. Not powerful like Tullus. Just good. He built things that worked, made Rome function better. That's not exciting, but it's important. Will he be remembered? The grandson asked. Probably not, the old man admitted. Not like the others, but the bridge will be remembered. And maybe that's what matters. Not that we remember him, but that we use what he built. They continued across the bridge, joining the flow of traffic that had become so routine that nobody thought about how remarkable it was that crossing the Tiber was no longer an ordeal requiring boats and risk. Just a simple walk across wooden planks that someone had thoughtfully placed there decades ago. 25 years after Ancus's death, Ostia had become essential to Rome's economy. The salt production was Rome's most reliable revenue source. The port handled trade from throughout the Mediterranean. The settlement had grown into a real city, with temples and markets and permanent population that identified as Ostian Roman, a new identity that Ancus had essentially created by founding the colony. We should thank Ancus Marcius. Someone suggested during a Senate discussion about port expansion, for having the foresight to establish Ostia when Rome didn't really need it yet. Did he know it would become this important? Another senator asked. Probably not. A third senator, old enough to have served during Ancus's reign, replied. He was just solving immediate problems. Rome needed access to salt and sea trade. He built infrastructure to provide that. The fact that it enabled all this subsequent growth was probably lucky more than planned, or he understood systems better than we thought. Someone else suggested. Built infrastructure that could grow, that would become more valuable over time rather than less. That's not luck, that's wisdom we didn't appreciate during his reign. The Senate agreed to name the expanded port facilities after Ancus Marcius. A small recognition, but something. An acknowledgement that maybe the boring king had actually been more important than they'd realized while he was alive. 50 years after Ancus's death, very few people remembered him personally. Those who'd served during his reign were dead or very old. The stories had faded to generalities. He built a bridge, founded a port, ruled competently but not memorably. The kind of summary that captured facts without capturing person. But his infrastructure remained. The bridge, now called the Pons Sublicius, as official name rather than just description, was Rome's most used crossing, had been repaired dozens of times. Some supports had been replaced entirely, but the basic design remained Ancus's design, still functional, still serving its purpose. Ostia was thriving. The salt works were expanded. The port was essential. The settlement had become Rome's maritime face, the place where Roman power met the wider Mediterranean world. The integrated populations were simply Roman now. The distinction between conquest origin and founding origin had blurred until it barely mattered. Families who'd come from Politorium or Alba Longa or other absorbed cities were just Roman families, indistinguishable from any others except by surname and family stories that fewer people cared about each generation. The systems Ancus had built, administrative, religious, economic, were Rome's normal functioning systems. Nobody thought about them as innovations anymore. They were just how things worked, the default state of Roman civilization. And that perhaps was Ancus's real legacy. Not buildings with his name on them. Not dramatic stories told around fires. Not legendary status or divine transformation. Just infrastructure so thoroughly integrated into daily life that people forgot it had been deliberately created by someone. at some time, for some purpose. The bridge was just the bridge. Ostia was just the port. The systems were just how Rome worked. Anonymous functionality. The highest form of success for a builder, creating things so useful that they became invisible, so normal that they were assumed, so essential that they were taken for granted. Ancus Marcius, the practical king, the bridge builder, the one who made Rome work so well that everyone forgot someone had to make those decisions, build that infrastructure, establish those systems. Forgotten in name, remembered in function. The legacy of competence, of sustainability, of building things that lasted beyond any individual's recognition. Not the dramatic story, but perhaps the important one. The evening fire burns low in our hearth now. The candles gutter. Outside, night has settled completely over the 7 hills where Rome grew and built and became something more than any single king could have planned. Ancus Marcius ruled for 24 years, built a bridge that still stands, founded a port that still functions, integrated populations that still thrive, created systems that still work. He was never called great, never became a god, never inspired epic poetry or legendary status. He was just competent, just practical, just focused on building things that would outlast his reign and serve Rome long after people forgot his name. And maybe that's the most important kind of king. Not the ones who burn brightest, but the ones who build foundations that let others burn bright later. The bridge stands in the darkness, carrying traffic across the Tiber as it has for decades, as it will for decades more. Anonymous infrastructure, essential function, taken for granted success. Ancus Marcius, the king nobody was excited about but everyone depended on. The builder who made himself unnecessary by building so well. The moderate who walked the middle path while everyone wanted extremes. Rome would remember Romulus the founder, would remember Numa the wise, would remember Tullus the warrior, would barely remember Ancus at all, but Rome would use his bridge, would trade through his port, would benefit from his systems, would thrive because of his infrastructure, forever, long after memory faded, long after names became footnotes, long after drama became history and history became legend, and legend became forgotten. The work would remain, the function would continue, the infrastructure would serve, anonymous, essential, lasting, the legacy of the practical king. The builder who understood that function mattered more than fame, that sustainability was worth more than spectacle, that making yourself forgettable while making your work essential was actually the highest form of success. Sleep well. The bridge still stands, the port still functions, the systems still work. Ancus Marcius, barely remembered, constantly used. The story continues, but his part is finished, as all parts finish. Eventually, even for builders, especially for builders, whose work outlasts their names. Another king's story complete, another chapter in Rome's long transformation from village to empire. Thank you for being here tonight, for spending these hours with Ancus Marcius and his patient work, for letting history unfold at its own contemplative pace, while you rest or study or simply listen. If this journey through early Rome serves you well, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe. New episodes arrive twice weekly, Sunday and Wednesday evenings, building Rome's story king by king, era by era, from mythological founding through republic and empire toward eventual fall. Each episode designed for extended listening, for sleep, for study, for the particular pleasure of learning without urgency. Next time, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, Rome's first Etruscan king, a wealthy outsider who transformed Roman monarchy, brought unprecedented grandeur, and began the sequence of events that would eventually teach Rome that cities can outgrow their need for kings. The monarchy's final phase begins. 3 more kings, each more problematic than the last, until Rome decides that kings themselves are the problem. But that unfolds slowly. We have time. Rate and review if you're inclined. It helps others find these stories. Share with fellow history lovers or anyone who needs something substantial for sleep or study. Support the channel if you're able, though listening is support enough. Most importantly, come back when you're ready. Rome will be here, patient, persistent, still growing through centuries of trial and error and accumulated wisdom. The fire is out, the story pauses. Until next time, friend, rest well.